Bullies trip him. They didn't know he's a jiu-jitsu champion, just holding back. Marcus Rivera adjusted the straps of his backpack as he stood before the imposing glass doors of Westfield High School, their surface reflecting the early morning October sun. At barely 5'6" and weighing maybe 130 pounds, he looked more like a freshman than a 17-year-old junior. His dark hair fell across his forehead in gentle waves, partially obscuring brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing in return. The oversized black hoodie he wore hung loosely on his frame, giving him an almost ethereal quality as he stood motionless, watching the stream of students flow through the entrance. "Just get through the day," he whispered to himself, the same mantra he'd adopted since his family had moved to this suburban Connecticut town 3 weeks ago. It was his father's advice, delivered with the calm certainty that Roberto Rivera brought to everything in life. Observe first, adapt second, act only when necessary. The hallways of Westfield High stretched before him like canyons, filled with the chaotic energy of nearly 2,000 students who had known each other since elementary school. Lockers slammed with metallic percussion, sneakers squeaked against polished linoleum, and conversations layered over each other in a symphony of teenage life. Marcus moved through it all like a ghost, his steps measured and deliberate, his breathing controlled in a way that spoke to years of disciplined training. He'd memorized his schedule the night before, just as he'd studied the school's layout on their website and researched the faculty. Preparation was everything his father had taught him that. Mathematics first period with Mrs. Henderson, followed by American literature with Mr. Kowalski, then chemistry with Dr. Martinez. Simple enough, if he could navigate the social minefield that seemed to surround every interaction. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly to a girl with purple streaks in her blonde hair who was fumbling with her locker combination. "Could you tell me where room 247 is?" She looked up, took in his appearance with a quick scan, and shrugged. "Upstairs, East Wing. Follow the signs." Her tone was neither friendly nor hostile, just indifferent, which Marcus preferred to the alternative. "Thank you," he replied, but she had already turned back to her locker, dismissing him from her attention. The mathematics classroom was exactly what he'd expected from a public high school utilitarian desks arranged in neat rows, a whiteboard that had seen better days, and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a slightly greenish hue. Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looked up as he entered. "You must be Marcus Rivera," she said with a smile that seemed genuine. "Welcome to Westfield. Please, take any open seat." Marcus chose a desk in the third row, close enough to appear engaged, but far enough back to avoid unwanted attention. As other students filed in, he kept his head down, reviewing his notes from his previous school. Mathematics had always been straightforward for him. Numbers didn't lie, didn't judge, didn't form cliques or hierarchies. They simply existed, waiting to be understood and manipulated according to logical rules. "So we have a new student," Mrs. Henderson announced once the bell had rung and the classroom had settled. "Marcus, would you like to introduce yourself to the class?" Every head turned toward him, and Marcus felt the familiar tension in his shoulders that came with unwanted attention. In his peripheral vision, he noted the various expressions, curiosity from some, apathy from others, and from a group of larger boys in the back corner, something that might have been predatory interest. "I'm Marcus Rivera," he said, his voice steady and quiet. "My family moved here from San Diego. I'm looking forward to learning with all of you." The response was underwhelming, a few nods, some whispered comments, and then the collective attention shifted back to Mrs. Henderson as she began discussing quadratic equations. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Perfect, unremarkable, forgettable, invisible. But invisibility, he was beginning to learn, was harder to achieve than he'd hoped. During the transition between first and second period, as he navigated the crowded hallway toward the English wing, He became aware of being watched, not the casual observation that came with being new, but something more focused, more intentional. "Check out the freshman," a voice said behind him, loud enough to be clearly heard over the hallway noise. Marcus didn't turn around, but his training kicked in automatically. His breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed, but his awareness expanded to encompass everything within a 20-foot radius. 3 males, based on the footsteps and voices, moving closer. The speaker was approximately 6 feet tall, heavy build, confident gait. 2 companions flanking him, one shorter and stockier, the other tall and lean. Think he's lost? This from the stocky one, voice carrying an undertone of amusement that Marcus recognized immediately. It was the sound predators made when they'd identified prey. "Probably looking for the elementary school," the first voice replied, and Marcus heard genuine laughter from several nearby students. Marcus continued walking, his pace unchanged, his expression neutral. In his mind, he could hear his father's voice from countless training sessions. "A warrior's greatest weapon is not his technique, mijo. It is his ability to remain calm when others lose their heads. Emotion makes you predictable. Control makes you dangerous." American literature passed without incident, though Marcus noticed the same 3 students from the hallway sitting together in the back corner, occasionally glancing in his direction and whispering among themselves. The teacher, Mr. Kowalski, was an energetic man in his 30s who seemed genuinely passionate about his subject, but Marcus found it difficult to focus on the discussion of The Great Gatsby when he could feel hostile attention boring into the back of his skull. During lunch, Marcus made his way to the cafeteria, purchased a simple sandwich and water, and looked for somewhere to sit quietly. The social geography of the space was immediately apparent. The popular kids held court at tables near the windows. The various academic and artistic cliques occupied the middle ground, and the outliers and loners scattered themselves along the periphery. Marcus chose an empty table near the far wall, positioning himself so he could observe the room while keeping his back to solid surface. He was halfway through his sandwich when they approached. "Mind if we sit?" The voice belonged to the leader from the hallway, and now Marcus could see him clearly. Tall, broad-shouldered with thick blonde hair, and the kind of easy confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. His Letterman jacket proclaimed him a member of the football team, and the way other students' eyes followed him suggested significant social status. Marcus looked up, meeting the boy's gaze directly for just a moment before returning his attention to his food. "It's a free country," he said quietly. The blonde boy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Hear that, guys? It's a free country." He sat down across from Marcus without invitation, his 2 friends flanking him like bodyguards. "I'm Kyle Brennan. This is Jake Morrison and Tommy Chen. We like to welcome new students to Westfield." Marcus continued eating, saying nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence was often the best response to provocation. Let them fill the void with their own words, their own assumptions, their own escalating aggression. "Not very talkative, are you?" Kyle continued, his voice carrying that same predatory amusement from the hallway. "Cat got your tongue." "I prefer to listen," Marcus replied evenly, still not looking up from his sandwich. "Listen to what?" Jake interjected. He was shorter than Kyle, but built like a wrestler, with dead eyes and the kind of brutal intensity that came from too many hits to the head. "Nobody's talking to you." Marcus took another bite of his sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed before responding. Exactly. The silence that followed was charged with tension. Marcus could feel Kyle's frustration building, could sense the older boy's confusion at his lack of reaction. Most people, when confronted by Kyle Brennan and his friends, would either cower or attempt to fight back. Marcus was doing neither, and it clearly unsettled them. "You know," Kyle said, leaning forward slightly, "most new kids try to make friends. join clubs, play sports, that kind of thing. What makes you so special that you think you can just ignore everyone? Marcus finally looked up, meeting Kyle's gaze with brown eyes that seemed impossibly calm. "I don't think I'm special," he said quietly. "I just want to eat my lunch in peace." "Peace," Tommy repeated, his voice mocking. He was the tallest of the three, a basketball player with the kind of casual cruelty that came from following stronger personalities. "Hear that? The little mouse wants peace." Marcus felt something shift inside him at the word mouse. Not anger exactly, but a recognition of what was happening, what these three represented, and what they intended to do to him over the coming months. He'd seen it before at his previous schools, though never quite this blatant, this organized. "Mouse," Kyle repeated, tasting the word. "I like that. It fits." He stood up, his friends following suit. "See you around, Mouse. This school's not as big as it looks. We'll be seeing a lot of each other." They walked away, leaving Marcus alone at his table with half a sandwich and the certain knowledge that his hope for invisibility had just died. Around the cafeteria, he could see other students watching, some with sympathy, others with anticipation, most with the kind of relief that came from knowing the predators had chosen someone else. Marcus finished his lunch methodically, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. Kyle Brennan was the alpha of his pack, that much was clear. Jake Morrison was the enforcer, the one who would escalate to physical violence most quickly. Tommy Chen was the follower, dangerous primarily because of his need to prove himself to the others. Classic pack dynamics, the kind his father had taught him to recognize and understand. "The mistake most people make," Roberto Rivera had told him during one of their late-night conversations in the garage gym behind their house, "is thinking that bullies are strong. They're not. They're weak, which is why they hunt in packs and target those they perceive as weaker still. A strong man doesn't need to prove his strength by hurting others." Chemistry class that afternoon confirmed Marcus's fears. Dr. Martinez assigned lab partners randomly, and Marcus found himself paired with a quiet girl named Amy, who seemed as eager as he was to avoid attention. They worked well together, mixing solutions and recording observations with minimal conversation, but Marcus was acutely aware of Kyle's presence 3 tables away. "So, you're the new kid," Amy said quietly, as they waited for their solution to react. "I heard Kyle Brennan introduced himself at lunch." Marcus glanced at her, noting the careful way she spoke, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "Word travels fast here." "Kyle makes sure it does," she replied, adjusting her safety goggles. "He likes everyone to know who he's targeting, makes the rest of us grateful it's not us." "Has he always been like this?" Amy was quiet for a long moment, focusing intently on their experiment. "Kyle's dad owns 3 car dealerships and donates a lot of money to the school," she finally said. "Kyle's been getting away with things since elementary school. The teachers either don't see it or don't want to see it." Marcus nodded, filing away this information. Power structures, he understood. His father had taught him about hierarchies, about how they functioned and how they could be disrupted. But Roberto had also taught him about patience, about the importance of understanding a situation completely before taking action. "The greatest victory is the one that requires no fighting," his father often said, quoting Sun Tzu. "But when fighting becomes unavoidable, it must be swift, decisive, and overwhelming." The rest of the school day passed without major incident, though Marcus noticed Kyle's group tracking his movements between classes. They didn't approach him again, but their presence was a constant reminder that his period of grace was over. By the time the final bell rang, Marcus had mentally catalogued the school's layout, identified potential exits and safe spaces, and begun formulating contingency plans. The walk home took him through residential streets lined with maple trees, just beginning to turn autumn colors. The October air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the school. Marcus lived with his parents in a modest ranch house on Elm Street, chosen specifically because it was within walking distance of the school and featured a detached garage that his father had immediately converted into a training space. "How was your first day, mijo?" Roberto Rivera asked as Marcus entered through the kitchen door. His father was preparing dinner, moving around the kitchen with the same fluid grace he'd once displayed in the octagon. Even in retirement, Roberto maintained the physique that had made him a feared competitor, lean, compact, and radiating the kind of quiet strength that came from absolute confidence in one's abilities. "Interesting," Marcus replied, dropping his backpack by the door and accepting the glass of water his father offered. "I met some of the local hierarchy." Roberto's dark eyes, so similar to his son's, sharpened with interest. "Tell me." Marcus described the encounters with Kyle's group, noting their behavior patterns, social dynamics, and obvious intent to establish dominance. Roberto listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as his son recounted details that revealed the depth of his observation and analysis. "And how do you plan to handle this situation?" Roberto asked when Marcus had finished. "Avoidance, if possible," Marcus replied immediately. "You always taught me that the best fight is the one you never have." "True," Roberto said, stirring sauce in a large pot. "But what if avoidance becomes impossible?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then I defend myself appropriately." Define appropriately. "Minimum force necessary to end the threat and ensure my safety," Marcus recited, the words automatic after years of training and discussion. "Control the situation, control myself, control the outcome." Roberto smiled, an expression of pride and concern in equal measure. "You understand the principles, but understanding and application are different things. It's easy to maintain control when you're sparring with me in our garage. It's much harder when you're surrounded by your peers, when your reputation and social standing are at stake." "You think I should fight them?" "I think," Roberto said carefully, "that you should be prepared for the possibility that fighting becomes unavoidable. Boys like this Kyle Brennan rarely accept passive resistance. They interpret it as weakness, which only encourages escalation." Marcus nodded, understanding the implication. His father wasn't advocating violence, but he was acknowledging reality. Some conflicts couldn't be resolved through peaceful means, no matter how much one might prefer alternatives. "If it comes to that," Marcus said quietly, "they won't be expecting what I can do." "No," Roberto agreed. "They won't. And that could be either your greatest advantage or your greatest burden." They ate dinner together, discussing Marcus's classes, teachers, and observations about the school's social structure. His mother, Elena, joined them when she returned from her job at the local hospital, and Marcus found himself downplaying the day's events for her benefit. Elena worried enough about her son's adjustment to yet another new school without adding concerns about potential violence. That evening, Marcus followed his usual routine in the garage gym. Stretching first, 45 minutes of flexibility and mobility work that left him feeling loose and centered. Then, technique drilling, flowing through the fundamental movements that formed the foundation of Brazilian jiu-jitsu guard pulls, hip escapes, basic submissions, and positional transitions. Finally, conditioning work that combined strength training with cardio, designed to build the kind of functional fitness that translated directly to grappling performance. Throughout the session, Roberto watched and occasionally offered corrections, but mostly he observed his son with the critical eye of a former professional fighter. Marcus moved with uncommon fluidity for someone his age, his techniques polished through thousands of repetitions under expert guidance. More importantly, he displayed the kind of calm focus that separated good fighters from great ones. "Your technique is sharp," Roberto observed as Marcus finished his workout. "But I sense hesitation in you." Marcus toweled off, considering his father's words. "I don't want to hurt anyone unnecessarily." "That speaks well of your character," Roberto replied. "But remember, mijo, sometimes showing restraint requires demonstrating capability first. These boys need to understand that you're choosing not to fight, not that you're incapable of fighting." "And if they don't give me that choice?" Roberto's expression grew serious, the playful demeanor that characterized most of their interactions replaced by the cold intensity that had made him successful in professional competition. "Then you show them the difference between someone who fights because he has to and someone who fights because he wants to. One is survival, the other is predation." Marcus nodded, understanding not just the words, but the weight behind them. His father had never glorified violence, but he'd also never pretended that the world was a place where good intentions alone provided protection. Sometimes, Roberto had taught him, the only language that certain people understood was the one spoken through applied force. That night, Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind processing the day's events and planning for tomorrow. He thought about Kyle Brennan's confidence, Jake Morrison's dead eyes, Tommy Chen's need to impress his friends. He thought about Amy's quiet warning and the way other students had watched his encounter with the trio, some with sympathy, but most with relief that they hadn't been chosen as targets. Most of all, he thought about his father's words about restraint and capability, about the difference between choosing not to fight and being unable to fight. Marcus had spent 8 years learning to hurt people efficiently, but he'd spent just as much time learning to control that capability, to use it only when absolutely necessary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his resolve and his restraint. Kyle's group would escalate their behavior, probing for weaknesses, looking for reactions that would justify further aggression. The pattern was as predictable as gravity, and Marcus knew from experience that passive resistance would only delay the inevitable confrontation. But delay, his father had taught him, could be its own form of strategy. Every day he avoided conflict was another day to observe, to learn, to understand the dynamics at play. When the time came, and Marcus was beginning to suspect it would come, he would be ready. For now, though, he would maintain his role as the quiet transfer student, the mouse that Kyle Brennan and his friends thought they were hunting. Let them believe they understood him. Let them mistake his restraint for weakness, his silence for submission. Marcus smiled slightly in the darkness, remembering another of his father's lessons. The most dangerous opponent is the one who appears harmless right up until the moment he strikes. Give them no reason to fear you until you give them every reason to fear you. Tomorrow would be another day of observation, another day of careful navigation through the social minefield of Westfield High School. But Marcus Rivera was patient, disciplined, and far more dangerous than anyone in that building could possibly imagine. He just hoped, for everyone's sake, that he wouldn't have to prove it. The harassment began subtly, almost playfully, the way a cat might bat at a mouse before delivering the killing blow. Marcus had expected it after their encounter in the cafeteria, but the systematic nature of Kyle's campaign surprised him with its calculated precision. It started the very next morning as Marcus walked through the main hallway toward his locker. The corridor was crowded with students rushing to first period, backpacks slung over shoulders, conversations flowing around him like water around a stone. Marcus maintained his usual measured pace, his awareness expanded, but his demeanor calm when he felt the impact. Kyle's shoulder caught him squarely in the back, sending Marcus stumbling forward into a cluster of sophomores who scattered with annoyed expressions. The force was carefully calibrated, not enough to send him sprawling, but sufficient to disrupt his balance and draw attention. "Whoa, sorry there, mouse." Kyle's voice carried clearly over the hallway noise, pitched just loud enough for nearby students to hear, but not so loud as to attract teacher attention. "Guess I didn't see you there. You're pretty easy to miss." Marcus steadied himself and turned, meeting Kyle's gaze with those same unnaturally calm brown eyes. "No problem," he said quietly, adjusting his backpack. "Accidents happen." But they both knew it wasn't an accident, and the smirk playing at the corners of Kyle's mouth confirmed it. Jake Morrison and Tommy Chen flanked their leader, their presence lending weight to what might otherwise seem like innocent clumsiness. "You should really watch where you're going," Jake added, his restless build making him seem larger in the confined space of the hallway. "Wouldn't want you to get hurt." Marcus said nothing, simply turned and continued toward his locker. Behind him, he heard Tommy's distinctive laugh and Kyle's voice, pitched lower now, but still audible. "Like I said, guys, the mouse doesn't even squeak when you step on his tail." The pattern established itself quickly. Every day brought new incidents, each one carefully designed to humiliate while remaining just below the threshold that might provoke administrative intervention. A shoulder check here, a deliberately loud comment there, the occasional accidental collision that sent Marcus's books scattering across the floor. "Watch it, freshman," became Jake's favorite greeting whenever their paths crossed, usually accompanied by a slight shove or deliberate intrusion into Marcus's personal space. The irony that Marcus was actually a junior seemed lost on them. Or perhaps they simply enjoyed the additional layer of disrespect the misidentification provided. Mrs. Patterson, Marcus's American literature teacher, seemed oblivious to the way Kyle would make comments during class discussions whenever Marcus volunteered an answer. Nothing overt, just stage-whispered observations like, "Looks like the mouse has opinions," or barely audible snickers that nonetheless disrupted the flow of conversation. When Marcus stopped volunteering answers, Kyle's campaign shifted to more direct provocations. "Rivera," Kyle would call out when Mrs. Patterson turned to write on the whiteboard. "You awake over there? You look like you might fall asleep." The teacher would turn back to find Kyle looking attentive while Marcus sat quietly in his seat, saying nothing. After the third such incident, Mrs. Patterson began giving Marcus pointed looks whenever the class grew restless, as if he were somehow responsible for the disruptions. The cafeteria became a particular battleground. Marcus had attempted to maintain his routine of eating alone at the table near the far wall, but Kyle's group seemed determined to make even this simple act an ordeal. They would walk past his table repeatedly, each transit involving some form of minor harassment. Jake might accidentally bump into Marcus's chair. Tommy would reach across the table for napkins he didn't need, deliberately disrupting Marcus's lunch. Kyle would simply stand nearby, not saying anything but radiating the kind of predatory attention that made eating impossible. "You know," Kyle said one Tuesday afternoon, sliding uninvited into the seat across from Marcus, "most people eat lunch with friends. What's wrong with you that nobody wants to sit with you?" Marcus continued eating his sandwich, not looking up. He'd learned that engaging verbally only provided Kyle with more ammunition, more opportunities to twist his words into evidence of weakness or arrogance. "I'm talking to you, Mouse," Kyle continued, his voice carrying that familiar edge of frustration that came whenever Marcus failed to provide the reaction he wanted. "It's rude to ignore people when they're trying to be friendly." "Is this what you call friendly?" The voice came from Amy Chen, the quiet girl from Marcus's chemistry class. She stood beside the table holding a lunch tray, her expression nervous but determined. "Because it looks like harassment to me." Kyle's attention shifted to her with laser-like focus, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He'd been careful to avoid involving others in his situation, understanding instinctively that Kyle's group would view any potential allies as additional targets. "Amy Chen," Kyle said, his voice taking on a mock-friendly tone that somehow managed to sound more threatening than outright hostility. "How nice of you to join our conversation, though I don't remember anyone asking for your opinion." "Maybe that's because your opinion is the only one that matters to you," Amy replied. though Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly as she set down her tray. Jake and Tommy materialized as if summoned, flanking the table with the practiced ease of longtime predators. The dynamic shifted immediately, 3 large male athletes surrounding Amy and Marcus like wolves circling prey. "Careful, Amy," Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that came from knowing his physical superiority was absolute. "You might want to think about who you're defending here. The mouse isn't worth the trouble." Marcus made his decision quickly, understanding that Amy's intervention, however well-intentioned, had created a dangerous escalation. He stood up, gathering his lunch and backpack with deliberate calm. "You don't need to leave," Amy said quickly, but Marcus was already moving. "Yes," Kyle said, his voice carrying clearly across the cafeteria. "He does. Run along, Mouse. Adults are talking." Marcus paused at Kyle's words, feeling something cold and dangerous stir in his chest. The dismissal was calculated, designed to humiliate him in front of Amy and the growing audience of students who had noticed the confrontation. For a moment, he considered turning around, considered letting Kyle see exactly what kind of mouse he'd chosen to corner. Instead, he looked directly at Amy. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but this isn't your fight." He walked away, leaving Amy alone with Kyle's group. Behind him, he heard Kyle's voice pitched to Carrie, "Smart mouse, he knows when he's outmatched." The next day, Amy didn't come to chemistry class. When Marcus asked Dr. Martinez about her absence, the teacher's expression grew troubled. "Amy won't be returning to my class," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "She's requested a schedule change, personal reasons." Marcus understood immediately. Kyle's group had made their displeasure known, and Amy had been forced to rearrange her entire academic schedule to avoid further harassment. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, a reminder that his decision to remain passive had consequences for others as well as himself. The incidents escalated as October wore on, each one more bold than the last. Kyle's group had apparently decided that Marcus's lack of response indicated weakness rather than restraint, and they adjusted their tactics accordingly. In gym class, Tommy Chen had taken to throwing basketballs at Marcus with unnecessary force during scrimmages. "Nothing personal, Mouse," he would say after each impact, "just trying to get the ball back." Coach Williams, a thick-set man in his 50s who seemed more interested in his clipboard than his students, never appeared to notice the pattern. Jake Morrison had perfected the art of the accidental collision, timing his movements through the hallways to create impacts that appeared coincidental but left Marcus stumbling or dropping his belongings. "Sorry, didn't see you there," became Jake's standard apology, delivered with the kind of insincerity that made it more insulting than saying nothing at all. But it was Kyle who proved most creative in his cruelty. He had apparently studied Marcus's schedule and habits, learning his routes through the school and timing his own movements to maximize opportunities for harassment. Marcus would round a corner to find Kyle leaning against the wall, blocking his path with casual indifference. He would enter a classroom to find Kyle already there, having claimed the seat directly behind Marcus's usual spot, ensuring a constant presence during lectures. "You know what I find interesting about mice?" Kyle asked one morning, speaking loudly enough for the entire pre-calculus class to hear. "They're so quiet. Like they're afraid if they make noise, the cats will notice them." Several students laughed, though Marcus noticed that some looked uncomfortable with Kyle's obvious targeting. Mrs. Henderson frowned, but said nothing, perhaps hoping the comment would pass without escalation. "But here's the thing about being quiet," Kyle continued, emboldened by the lack of intervention. "Sometimes it just makes you invisible, like you don't even exist." Marcus kept his eyes on his textbook, his breathing controlled, his hands steady. In his peripheral vision, he could see Mrs. Henderson's internal struggle between maintaining classroom order and avoiding confrontation with Kyle Brennan, whose father's donations helped fund the math department's new computers. The harassment began extending beyond school hours as Marcus walked home one afternoon in late October, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter. He'd made it 2 blocks from Westfield High when he heard the car engine behind him, moving slowly enough to match his walking pace. "Hey, Mouse!" Kyle's voice called from the passenger seat of a silver BMW. "Where you going? Don't you have any friends to hang out with?" Marcus didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the car's presence, simply continued walking at his measured pace. The BMW crept along beside him, its engine purring with expensive precision. "I asked you a question," Kyle called out, his voice carrying that familiar edge of frustration. "It's rude to ignore people." Jake was driving, Marcus noted, his wrestler's hands gripping the steering wheel as he matched the car's speed to Marcus's walking pace. Tommy occupied the back seat, leaning forward to peer out the window with the kind of excited anticipation that suggested this had been planned. "Maybe he can't hear us," Tommy suggested loudly. "Maybe there's something wrong with his ears. Or maybe," Jake added, "he's just too good to talk to regular people." Marcus turned down Elm Street, hoping they would lose interest once he entered his residential neighborhood. Instead, the BMW followed, its presence now clearly threatening rather than merely harassing. "Nice house," Kyle observed as Marcus approached his front door. "Pretty small, though. Bet your family doesn't have much money." Marcus paused at his front gate, finally turning to face the car. Kyle leaned out the passenger window, his expression carrying a mixture of amusement and calculation. "See you tomorrow, Mouse," Kyle said with mock friendliness. "Looking forward to another exciting day at school." The BMW drove away, but its message had been delivered clearly. There was no escape from Kyle's attention, no safe space where Marcus could exist without harassment. The psychological pressure was as carefully applied as any physical technique, designed to create a sense of helplessness and isolation. That evening, Marcus discovered the next phase of Kyle's campaign when his phone buzzed with notifications from social media platforms he rarely used. Someone had created fake accounts using variations of his name and posted embarrassing memes featuring his school photo, doctored to make him appear weak, pathetic, or ridiculous. "Check out Westfield's newest loser," read one post, accompanied by a picture of Marcus with digitally added mouse ears. "This kid thinks he's too good to talk to anyone. Someone should teach him some manners." The comments section below was filled with responses from students he barely recognized, some defending him, but most joining in the mockery. Marcus realized that Kyle's influence extended far beyond his immediate circle, that he'd somehow convinced a significant portion of the student body to participate in the harassment campaign. "Mijo," his father's voice interrupted his examination of the posts. Roberto stood in the doorway of Marcus's room, his expression concerned. "Everything all right?" Marcus considered lying, minimizing the situation to avoid worrying his parents. But Roberto Rivera had spent years reading opponents, learning to detect deception and hidden intentions. There was no point in trying to fool him. "Some students at school are posting things about me online," Marcus said, showing his father the phone. Roberto examined the posts carefully, his expression growing darker with each image. When he finished, he handed the phone back and sat on the edge of Marcus's bed. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly. "The online stuff is new. The rest has been building for a few weeks." "Tell me everything." Marcus found himself describing the entire campaign, Kyle's systematic harassment, the escalating incidents, the way teachers either ignored or inadvertently enabled the behavior. Roberto listened without interruption, his fighter's mind analyzing patterns and tactics with professional precision. "They're following you home?" Roberto's voice carried a dangerous edge that Marcus had rarely heard outside the training room. "Just that once. Today." Roberto was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the room. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "I could speak with the school administration," he said finally, "or with this Kyle's parents." "That would make it worse," Marcus replied immediately. "They'd just be more careful, more subtle, and they'd know I couldn't handle it myself." Roberto nodded slowly, understanding the dynamics at play. "So what do you want to do?" Marcus considered the question carefully. His instinct was to continue enduring, to maintain the strategy of passive resistance that had served him well in previous schools. But Kyle's group was more organized, more persistent than any bullies he'd encountered before. Their campaign was escalating in both scope and intensity, showing no signs of diminishing with time. "I want to finish what I started," Marcus said finally. "I want to get through the school year without having to hurt anyone." "Even if they won't let you?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both father and son understood perfectly. Roberto wasn't asking if Marcus was capable of defending himself. They both knew the answer to that question. He was asking whether Marcus was prepared for the possibility that his restraint might be interpreted as weakness, that his desire to avoid violence might ultimately make violence inevitable. "If they force my hand," Marcus said quietly, "then they force my hand. But I won't be the one who chooses violence first." Roberto smiled slightly, pride and concern warring in his expression. "Your grandfather used to say that a man's character is revealed not by how he wins, but by how he chooses to fight." What did he mean? That anyone can be vicious when they have advantage. It takes real strength to remain human when others choose to be animals. The conversation was interrupted by the buzzing of Marcus's phone, another notification from social media, another post designed to humiliate and isolate him. This time, someone had photoshopped his face onto the body of a cartoon mouse, complete with tail and whiskers. "They're very creative," Roberto observed dryly, "but creativity without wisdom is just elaborate foolishness." Should I respond? Try to defend myself? What would your response accomplish? Marcus considered this. Any attempt to defend himself online would likely be seen as weakness, proof that Kyle's campaign was getting to him. Worse, it would provide Kyle with additional ammunition, more ways to twist his words into evidence of his unsuitability for Westfield's social hierarchy. "Nothing positive," Marcus admitted. "Then you have your answer." But ignoring the online harassment proved more difficult than Marcus had anticipated. The posts multiplied daily, each one more creative and more vicious than the last. Someone had created an entire fake social media profile for him, complete with invented interests and embarrassing fictional posts. Students who had never spoken to him began referencing the fake profile in real life, asking about hobbies he didn't have or opinions he'd never expressed. "Hey, Mouse," a sophomore girl called out as Marcus passed her locker. "I saw your post about collecting stuffed animals. That's so cute." Marcus had never posted anything about stuffed animals, had never even owned a social media account until Kyle's group had forced him to create one to monitor their harassment. But explaining this would require acknowledging the fake profile's existence, which would only draw more attention to Kyle's campaign. The psychological pressure was beginning to take its toll. Marcus found himself constantly alert, always watching for the next incident, the next humiliation. His sleep became restless, filled with dreams of confrontation and violence that left him feeling more tired upon waking than when he'd gone to bed. In chemistry class, Dr. Martinez noticed his deteriorating focus. "Mr. Rivera," the teacher said, after Marcus had fumbled a simple measurement for the third time, "perhaps you should visit the nurse. You seem unwell." Marcus shook his head, forcing himself to concentrate on the experiment. Around him, his classmates worked with easy camaraderie, their biggest concerns involving weekend plans and upcoming tests. None of them lived with the constant awareness that predators were circling, that every moment of peace was temporary, borrowed time before the next attack. The breaking point came during a particularly elaborate incident in the school library. Marcus had claimed a corner table on the second floor, hoping to find some peace while researching a history project. The library was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of pages turning and keyboards clicking, an oasis of calm in the chaos of Westfield High School. Kyle's group entered like a storm front, their presence immediately disrupting the studious atmosphere. They didn't approach Marcus directly. Instead, they claimed a table near the stairwell, positioning themselves to monitor his movements while maintaining the appearance of legitimate study. For 20 minutes, Marcus tried to focus on his research, but their whispered conversations and pointed glances made concentration impossible. Finally, Kyle stood up and walked toward the history section, his path taking him directly past Marcus's table. "Research is so important," Kyle said loudly enough for nearby students to hear, "especially when you're trying to figure out where you fit in." He paused beside Marcus's table, looking down at the open textbooks. "What are you working on, Mouse? A report on rodents?" Marcus didn't look up from his notes, but his hand tightened involuntarily around his pen. The plastic creaked under the pressure, a barely audible sound that nonetheless spoke to the tension building inside him. "Not very talkative today," Kyle continued, his voice carrying that familiar tone of mock concern. "I hope you're not sick. It would be terrible if something happened to you." The words were carefully chosen, technically expressing concern while carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of threat. Marcus forced his breathing to remain steady, forced his expression to remain neutral, but inside he felt something fundamental beginning to crack. "Kyle," Mrs. Peterson, the librarian, called from the front desk, "please keep your voice down. This is a place of study." "Sorry, Mrs. P," Kyle replied with exaggerated contrition. "I was just trying to help a fellow student with his research." He walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his books and the growing realization that this would never end. Kyle's campaign wasn't designed to achieve any specific goal. It was simply a form of entertainment, a way for him to demonstrate his power and social dominance. As long as Marcus remained at Westfield High School, he would be Kyle's target, his personal source of amusement and validation. That evening, Marcus sat in the garage gym with his father, going through their usual training routine. But his movements lacked their typical fluidity, his focus constantly disrupted by replaying the day's incidents and anticipating tomorrow's harassment. "Your technique is sloppy tonight," Roberto observed as Marcus fumbled a basic guard pass. "Your mind is elsewhere." Marcus stopped mid-movement, sitting back on his heels with frustration clear on his face. "I can't stop thinking about them, about what they're going to do next." "And what do you think they're going to do?" "Something worse. They always escalate. Today it was the library. Yesterday it was following me home. Tomorrow it'll be something else, something more public, more humiliating." Roberto nodded thoughtfully. "So you're allowing them to live in your head rent-free?" "What do you mean? They're not just attacking you at school, mijo. They're attacking you here, in our home, during our training time. They're taking up space in your thoughts, your emotions, your focus. In effect, they're winning without even being present." Marcus understood immediately. Kyle's campaign was working not just because of the physical incidents, but because of the psychological pressure, the constant anticipation of the next attack. Even in the safety of his home, surrounded by the familiar comfort of training equipment and his father's guidance, he couldn't escape the harassment. "So how do I get them out of my head?" Roberto smiled slightly. "By deciding that your peace of mind is more valuable than their opinions, by remembering that their behavior says nothing about you and everything about them." "But they're not going to stop." "No," Roberto agreed. "Probably not, which means you need to decide what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with another social media notification. This time, someone had posted a video claiming to show Marcus being rejected by a girl at another school, though the footage was clearly doctored and the person in the video bore only superficial resemblance to him. Persistent, Roberto observed, reading over Marcus's shoulder. Creative too, Marcus replied bitterly. Creativity without character is just elaborate weakness, Roberto said, echoing his earlier observation. They're spending enormous amounts of time and energy trying to make you feel bad about yourself. Ask yourself why. Marcus considered this. Because they have nothing better to do? Because they're threatened by you. Threatened? By me? Roberto set down the phone and looked directly at his son. Think about it, mijo. You've been at their school for less than 2 months. You don't seek attention, don't try to impress anyone, don't compete for social status, yet somehow your mere presence bothers them enough to organize this elaborate campaign. Why do you think that is? Marcus had never considered the question from this angle. In his mind, Kyle's group had targeted him because he seemed like an easy victim, quiet, small, new to the school. But his father was suggesting something different, that his very refusal to seek their approval had somehow threatened their social order. Because I don't need them, Marcus said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. Exactly. You don't need their approval, their acceptance, their permission to exist. That threatens people who derive their entire sense of self-worth from their position in a hierarchy they can't control. The insight was both liberating and troubling. If Roberto was right, then Kyle's harassment wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about Kyle's own insecurities, his need to maintain dominance in a social system that required constant validation through the domination of others. So what do I do with that information? You remember it, Roberto said simply. You remember that their behavior is about them, not you. And you decide whether you're willing to continue being their source of entertainment. Marcus went to bed that night with his father's words echoing in his mind. The harassment would continue. Kyle had made that clear through both his actions and his escalating boldness. But perhaps Marcus had been approaching the situation incorrectly, focusing on endurance rather than resolution, on avoiding conflict rather than addressing its root causes. For 8 years, he'd trained his body to be a weapon, but he'd also trained his mind to seek peaceful solutions, to exhaust all alternatives before resorting to violence. That training had served him well, had kept him out of serious trouble despite multiple school transfers and constant exposure to potential conflicts. But Kyle Brennan and his group represented something different. They weren't seeking resolution or even rational dominance. They were seeking entertainment at his expense, and no amount of passive resistance would satisfy their need for reaction and engagement. As Marcus drifted towards sleep, he found himself thinking about Amy Chen's forced schedule change, about the fake social media profiles, about Kyle's car following him home. The campaign was expanding, involving more students, affecting innocent bystanders who had tried to help him. How long before the harassment escalated to direct physical violence? How long before Kyle's need for entertainment demanded more than psychological torture? And when that moment came, would Marcus be ready to abandon his commitment to peaceful resolution in favor of protecting himself and others? The questions followed him into sleep, where his dreams were filled with scenarios of confrontation and consequence, of choices that could not be undone, and actions that would define him for the rest of his high school career. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his resolve and his restraint. But increasingly, Marcus suspected that his strategy of passive endurance was approaching its limits, that Kyle's escalating campaign would eventually force him to choose between continued victimization and decisive action. The mouse was learning that sometimes the only way to stop being prey was to remind the predators that they, too, could be hunted. November had arrived with the kind of biting cold that made the hallways of Westfield High feel like wind tunnels, students hunched into their jackets as they hurried between classes. For Marcus Rivera, the weather felt appropriate somehow, matching the increasingly hostile atmosphere that surrounded him wherever he went. Kyle Brennan's campaign had reached a fever pitch of creativity and cruelty, evolving from simple harassment into something approaching psychological warfare. The fake social media profiles had multiplied like a virus, each one more elaborate than the last. Someone had created an entire alternate reality where Marcus was portrayed as everything from a social outcast to a dangerous loner, complete with fabricated posts about violent fantasies and inappropriate behavior toward female students. The posts were carefully crafted to seem believable while remaining just outrageous enough to generate maximum humiliation. "Hey, Rivera," a senior Marcus barely recognized called out as he passed the senior locker bay. "I saw your post about wanting to hurt people who ignore you. That's pretty messed up, man." Marcus paused, confusion evident on his face. "I never posted anything like that." The senior's expression shifted from confrontational to uncertain. "It's all over social media. Someone posted screenshots of your account saying you fantasize about getting revenge on classmates." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The fake profiles had apparently evolved beyond simple mockery into character assassination, complete with fabricated evidence of antisocial behavior. He pulled out his phone and quickly searched for his name, finding dozens of shared screenshots showing posts he'd never made from accounts he'd never created. "That's not my account," he said quietly. But the senior was already walking away, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. In the bathroom between third and fourth period, Marcus overheard two sophomores discussing him in hushed tones. "My older sister says he's been making threats online," one whispered. "Says he wrote about bringing weapons to school." "No way," the other replied. "He seems so quiet." "That's what makes it scary. It's always the quiet ones." Marcus stood frozen in the stall, listening to his reputation being destroyed by lies so elaborate they'd taken on a life of their own. The fabricated posts were being shared and discussed as if they were real, creating a narrative that painted him as potentially dangerous rather than simply pathetic. When he emerged from the stall, both sophomores fell silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They hurried out without washing their hands, leaving Marcus alone with his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sinks. For the first time since the harassment had begun, he looked truly defeated. Dark circles under his eyes spoke to weeks of disrupted sleep. His shoulders, usually held with unconscious confidence born of years of training, now curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller, less visible. The psychological pressure was taking a physical toll, aging him beyond his 17 years. Chemistry class that afternoon brought a new low. Dr. Martinez, normally one of the few teachers who seemed to notice and care about student welfare, pulled Marcus aside after the lesson. "Marcus," the teacher said carefully, "I've been hearing some concerning things about social media posts attributed to you. I wanted to give you a chance to address them before I'm required to report anything to administration." Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. "Dr. Martinez, those posts aren't real. Someone's been creating fake accounts using my name." The teacher's expression was sympathetic, but troubled. "I understand that's your position, but the school has policies about threats, even perceived ones. I need you to know that several students have expressed concerns about their safety." "Concerns about their safety? From me?" "From posts that appear to come from you, yes." Dr. Martinez lowered his voice. "Marcus, I've worked with you for months. This doesn't match your character at all, but perception becomes reality in situations like this. You need to be very careful about how you handle yourself moving forward." The conversation left Marcus feeling more isolated than ever. Not only was he being systematically harassed, but Kyle's group had successfully manipulated the narrative to make him appear as the aggressor. Students who had previously ignored him now watched him with wariness or fear, while teachers viewed him as a potential threat requiring monitoring. During lunch, Marcus sat alone at his usual table, but now the isolation felt different. Where once students had simply been indifferent to his presence, now they actively avoided him. Conversations stopped when he walked by, replaced by whispered exchanges and nervous glances. "Look at him sitting there," a voice carried from several tables away, "just staring at everyone. It's creepy." Marcus wasn't staring at anyone, he was simply eating his sandwich while lost in thought, but perception had indeed become reality. Every normal action was now interpreted through the lens of the fabricated online persona Kyle's group had created for him. Kyle himself appeared to be enjoying the situation immensely. He held court at his usual table, surrounded by admirers and hangers-on who laughed at his commentary about the dangerous transfer student and his disturbing online behavior. Occasionally, Kyle would glance in Marcus's direction with undisguised satisfaction, like an artist admiring his masterpiece. "I heard he's been suspended from 2 other schools," Jake Morrison announced loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "That's probably why his family keeps moving around." "My mom works at the district office," a girl Marcus didn't recognize chimed in. "She says they're considering transferring him to the alternative school." Marcus gripped his sandwich wrapper tightly, the plastic crinkling in his fist. The alternative school was where Westfield sent its genuine problem students, the ones who'd been kicked out of regular classes for violence, drug possession, or chronic behavioral issues. The fact that his name was apparently being discussed in administrative circles meant Kyle's campaign had succeeded beyond even his own expectations. The afternoon brought perhaps the cruelest innovation yet. During gym class, Coach Williams announced that students would be paired randomly for wrestling drills, a decision that Marcus suspected wasn't as random as claimed. When his name was called alongside Brett Patterson, a 200-pound offensive lineman known for his aggressive playing style, Marcus understood immediately what was being orchestrated. "Nothing personal, Rivera," Brett said as they took their positions on the mat, "but I heard you've been making some pretty intense posts online. Maybe you need to learn some humility." The wrestling drill was supposed to involve basic takedown techniques, with partners rotating every few minutes to practice with different opponents. But Brett approached the exercise like a real fight, using his size and strength advantage to slam Marcus to the mat with unnecessary force. "That's it, Patterson," Coach Williams called out approvingly. "Show him how it's done." Marcus absorbed the punishment without complaint, using his superior technique to avoid serious injury while making it appear that Brett was dominating the exchange. But each impact drove home the same message. Even the adults were now complicit in his harassment, either through active participation or willful ignorance. When the drill ended, Brett offered Marcus a hand up with mock sportsmanship. "Good work, Rivera. Maybe next time you'll think twice before running your mouth online." Marcus accepted the hand and stood, saying nothing. Around the gym, other students watched with the kind of fascination reserved for car accidents or public humiliation. He was no longer a person to them, he was entertainment, a spectacle to be observed and discussed. The walk home that evening felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with the accumulated stress of months of harassment. The October air was crisp and clear, but Marcus barely noticed the beauty of the changing leaves or the comfortable suburban atmosphere of his neighborhood. His mind was consumed with the growing realization that his strategy of passive endurance was not only failing, but actively making his situation worse. At home, he found his parents in the kitchen, their expressions immediately shifting to concern when they saw his face. "Mijo," his father said carefully, "you look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders." Marcus dropped his backpack by the door and accepted the glass of water his mother offered. "How bad would it be if I had to transfer schools again?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Elena Rivera, who had been preparing dinner, turned to face her son with alarm. Roberto's expression grew very still, the kind of dangerous calm that Marcus had learned to recognize from their training sessions. "What happened?" Roberto asked quietly. Marcus found himself describing the latest escalations, the fake social media profiles, the fabricated threats, the way other students and even teachers now viewed him with suspicion and fear. His parents listened without interruption, their expressions growing darker with each revelation. "They're making me look like a school shooter," Marcus finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "People are actually afraid of me now." Elena's face had gone pale. "This is too much. We need to contact the school, the police, someone." "And tell them what?" Marcus asked. "That someone created fake social media accounts. They'll just say I could have done it myself for attention. There's no proof of who's behind it." Roberto was quiet for a long moment, his fighter's mind working through the tactical implications. "Show me the posts." Marcus pulled out his phone and navigated to the various fake profiles, each one a masterpiece of character assassination. The posts were carefully crafted to suggest antisocial tendencies without crossing the line into explicit threats. Violent fantasies expressed as dark humor, complaints about other students framed as harmless venting, social isolation portrayed as superiority complex. "Very sophisticated," Roberto observed grimly. "Whoever did this understands psychology and social manipulation." "Kyle Brennan," Marcus said simply. "You're certain?" "He's the only one with motivation and resources. His father's money, his social connections, his influence over other students. This has his fingerprints all over it." Roberto handed back the phone and looked directly at his son. "What do you want to do?" The question was loaded with implication. Roberto wasn't asking about Marcus's immediate plans, he was asking about his fundamental approach to a situation that had spiraled beyond conventional solutions. "I want it to stop," Marcus said. "I want to go to school without wondering what new humiliation is waiting for me. I want to eat lunch in peace. I want to focus on my education instead of constantly watching my back." "And you believe Kyle Brennan will simply lose interest and move on to other targets?" Marcus considered this honestly. Kyle's campaign had become self-perpetuating, fed by the reactions it generated and the social status it provided. The fake social media profiles had elevated the harassment from simple bullying to community event, with dozens of students participating in sharing and discussing the fabricated content. "No," Marcus admitted, "he's enjoying this too much, and it's working too well." Then we come back to the same question. What are you prepared to do about it? Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed with notifications. 3 new posts on the fake profiles, each one more elaborate than the last. Someone had photoshopped his face onto images of historic school shooters, complete with fake quotes about planning revenge against his classmates. Elena gasped when she saw the screen. "This is beyond bullying. This is criminal." "Yes," Roberto agreed, "it is. But proving it and stopping it are 2 different things." Marcus stared at the fabricated images, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. The posts weren't just cruel, they were dangerous. The kind of content that could result in criminal charges, federal investigation, and permanent destruction of his future. Kyle had escalated beyond simple harassment into territory that could destroy Marcus's life completely. "He's not going to stop," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new edge. "This isn't entertainment anymore. He's trying to destroy me." "And if he succeeds?" Roberto asked. Marcus thought about alternative schools, criminal investigations, college applications tainted by fabricated evidence of violent tendencies. He thought about his parents' worry, his mother's fear, his father's controlled anger at watching his son being systematically destroyed by lies. "Then I lose everything," Marcus said quietly. My education, my future, my reputation, everything. Roberto nodded slowly. So the question becomes, are you going to let him take everything from you, or are you going to take control of the situation? That night, Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. For months, he'd maintained his commitment to peaceful resolution, enduring harassment that would have broken most people. But Kyle's latest escalation had crossed a line from bullying into something approaching persecution. The fake social media profiles weren't just humiliating, they were potentially life-destroying. In an era when online content could follow someone forever, when college admissions officers and employers routinely checked social media histories, Kyle was attempting to create a permanent record of fabricated antisocial behavior that could haunt Marcus for decades. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of confrontation and consequence. In his unconscious mind, Marcus found himself reliving every incident, every humiliation, every moment of restraint that had been interpreted as weakness. He woke several times, his body tense with suppressed energy, his training instincts activated by the stress of constant threat. The next morning brought what would prove to be the final straw. Marcus arrived at school to find a crowd gathered around the main entrance, students clustered in excited groups, examining their phones and whispering among themselves. As he approached, conversations stopped and heads turned, tracking his movement with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for celebrities or criminals. There he is, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. He doesn't look dangerous, another voice observed. That's what makes it scary. Marcus pushed through the crowd, ignoring the stares and whispered comments, focusing on reaching his locker without incident. But as he climbed the stairs to the second floor, he became aware of a larger gathering ahead, something that made his stomach clench with dread. Kyle's group had positioned themselves near the stairwell that led to the main hallway, their placement strategic and deliberate. Kyle leaned against the wall with his trademark smirk, while Jake and Tommy flanked the narrow passage like sentries. Behind them, a crowd of students had gathered, their phones ready to record whatever was about to unfold. Marcus paused at the top of the stairs, recognizing the setup immediately. This wasn't random harassment, it was a carefully orchestrated confrontation, designed to maximize humiliation and social media impact. The crowd's presence made retreat impossible without appearing cowardly, while advancing meant walking directly into Kyle's trap. "Well, well," Kyle called out loudly, his voice carrying clearly in the concrete stairwell. "Look who decided to show up today. I was starting to worry about you, Mouse." Marcus descended the stairs slowly, his movements controlled despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. Around him, students pressed against the walls to create a clear path, their phones capturing every moment of what they sensed would be significant entertainment. "I saw your latest posts," Kyle continued, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Pretty intense stuff. All that anger about being ignored and mistreated. Makes a person wonder what you might do about it." "I didn't write those posts," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Of course you didn't," Kyle replied with exaggerated understanding. "Just like you didn't write all the others. It's amazing how many fake accounts someone would have to create to make you look so bad." Laughter rippled through the crowd, students enjoying the performance while remaining safely on the sidelines. Marcus reached the bottom of the stairs and attempted to walk around Kyle's group, but Jake stepped into his path with practiced ease. "Where are you going so fast?" Jake asked, his wrestler's build making him seem enormous in the confined space. "Kyle was talking to you." "I need to get to class," Marcus replied, his breathing becoming carefully controlled, a warning sign that his body was preparing for action despite his mind's commitment to restraint. "Class can wait," Kyle said, pushing off from the wall and moving to block Marcus's other avenue of escape. "We're having a conversation here. It would be rude to leave in the middle." Marcus found himself surrounded, trapped in a triangle formation with Kyle's group controlling all possible exits. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen, their phones creating a digital arena where his humiliation would be preserved and shared for posterity. "You know what I find interesting about your posts?" Kyle continued, clearly enjoying the attention and Marcus's trapped position. "All that talk about being stronger than people think, about knowing how to hurt people who cross you, big words for such a little mouse." "I never wrote anything like that," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby students step back involuntarily. "Right, of course," Kyle said with mock seriousness. "Someone else is pretending to be you online, making you look like a dangerous psycho. That's your story?" Tommy laughed loudly. "Maybe we should be scared, Kyle. Maybe the mouse is going to show us his kung fu moves." The mockery hit Marcus like a physical blow. His 8 years of Brazilian jiu-jitsu training wasn't kung fu, but the dismissive reference to martial arts was clearly calculated to ridicule any suggestion that he might be capable of defending himself. "What's the matter, Rivera?" Kyle asked, stepping closer until he was invading Marcus's personal space. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you too busy planning your next threatening post?" Marcus tried to step around him, but Kyle shifted to block his path again. The movement was deliberate, designed to force physical contact that could be portrayed as Marcus initiating aggression. "I just want to get to class," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "And I just want to have a friendly conversation with my classmate," Kyle replied innocently. "Why are you being so antisocial? It's almost like you really are as dangerous as your posts suggest." The crowd laughed again, enjoying the verbal sparring while remaining safely on the sidelines. Marcus could see teachers walking past in the distance, but none of them seemed inclined to investigate the growing commotion. "Maybe he needs help expressing himself," Jake suggested, moving closer from behind. "Maybe he's too shy to tell us how he really feels." Marcus felt the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. He was outnumbered 3-1, surrounded by hostile forces in a confined space, with an audience of potential witnesses who were more interested in entertainment than truth. Every instinct developed through years of training screamed at him to act, to neutralize the threats before they could escalate further. But still, he held back. Still, he chose restraint over action, peace over violence, endurance over retaliation. That choice proved to be a mistake. Kyle nodded to Jake, a subtle signal that Marcus caught but couldn't react too quickly enough. Jake's foot shot out in a perfectly timed leg sweep, catching Marcus's ankle as he attempted to step around Kyle. The technique was simple but effective, designed to send him tumbling down the concrete stairs that stretched below them. Time seemed to slow as Marcus felt himself falling, his books scattering as gravity took hold. His jiu-jitsu training kicked in automatically, his body twisting mid-air to protect his spine, his hands shooting out to break his fall, his core engaging to absorb the impact. He hit the concrete hard but controlled, rolling to distribute the force across his body rather than taking it all in one devastating blow. The landing drove the air from his lungs and sent pain shooting through his left shoulder, but his training had prevented serious injury. What hurt more than the physical impact was the explosion of laughter that erupted from the crowd above him. "Oops," Kyle's voice carried clearly down the stairwell, dripping with false concern. "Guess the mouse isn't very coordinated." Marcus lay on the cold concrete, surrounded by his scattered belongings and the mocking laughter of his classmates. His chemistry notebook was crumpled and dirty, its pages separated from the binding. His textbook lay with its spine bent at an unnatural angle, probably ruined. But these physical damages paled in comparison to the psychological assault of dozens of students recording his humiliation for social media immortality. Above him, Kyle continued his performance for the audience. "Maybe you should watch where you're going, Mouse. These stairs can be dangerous for little rodents." More laughter, more phones recording, more evidence of Marcus Rivera's weakness and social irrelevance. He could already imagine the videos spreading through social media, adding to the fictional narrative Kyle had constructed about his character and behavior. But as Marcus lay there, something fundamental shifted inside him. The weeks of harassment, the fake social media profiles, the systematic destruction of his reputation, the isolation from classmates and suspicion from teachers, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. Kyle Brennan wasn't going to stop. This wasn't entertainment that would eventually grow boring. This was persecution that would continue until Marcus transferred schools again, leaving behind another destroyed reputation and another set of fabricated lies to follow him wherever he went. For months, Marcus had chosen restraint, believing that endurance and moral superiority would eventually triumph over cruelty and manipulation. But Kyle had proven that restraint could be weaponized against him, that his refusal to fight back would be interpreted as proof of his weakness and his unsuitability for their social hierarchy. Marcus rose from the concrete with fluid grace that caught several students off guard, his movements suddenly different, more purposeful, carrying the kind of controlled power that came from years of disciplined training. He dusted off his jeans deliberately, then began collecting his scattered belongings with methodical precision. The laughter above him faltered slightly as students noticed the change in his demeanor. Where before he had seemed defeated, now he radiated the kind of calm focus that preceded decisive action. "That was pretty clumsy, Mouse," Kyle called down, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Maybe you should—" "My name," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the crowd noise with startling clarity, "is Marcus Rivera." He straightened and looked directly at Kyle for the first time in months, meeting his tormentor's gaze with brown eyes that had transformed from patient endurance to something far more dangerous. What Kyle saw in those eyes made him step backward involuntarily, his confident smirk faltering for the first time since their campaign had begun. The laughter died instantly. Something in Marcus's tone, his posture, his sudden direct eye contact made everyone in the stairwell pay attention with the kind of focused awareness usually reserved for genuine threats. Kyle recovered quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment at his involuntary retreat in front of his audience. "I don't care what your name is, freak. You're still a—" "Tomorrow," Marcus interrupted again, his voice calm but carrying an edge that silenced Kyle's response. "After school, the empty parking lot behind the gym." The words hit the crowd like a physical force, creating a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. For months, he had absorbed their harassment without response, leading them to believe he was incapable of defending himself. Now, suddenly, he was issuing a direct challenge to their leader. Kyle blinked, certain he had misheard. "What? You want to finish this?" Marcus asked, shouldering his backpack with movements that seemed somehow more fluid, more dangerous than before. "Then let's finish it. Just you and me." Jake laughed nervously, but the sound was forced and unconvincing. "Is the little mouse trying to sound tough?" Marcus's gaze shifted to Jake, and the wrestler felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. "If you want to make it 2-on-1, that's your choice, but know that I won't hold back anymore." The word "anymore" hung in the air like a threat, implying capabilities that none of them had suspected. Marcus had always seemed quiet and passive, absorbing their harassment without resistance, but now something in his voice suggested that his restraint had been a choice rather than an inability. Kyle's face was red, trapped by his reputation and the crowd's expectant attention. He couldn't back down without losing face, but something about Marcus's sudden transformation had unsettled him deeply. You're crazy if you think I'm wasting time fighting some scrawny transfer student, Kyle said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Then stop bothering me, Marcus replied simply. Your choice. He turned and walked up the stairs, moving through the crowd that parted before him like water. Students who had been laughing moments before now watched him with uncertainty, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Wait, Kyle called after him, his voice cracking slightly. But Marcus didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the call, simply continued walking toward his classroom with the same measured pace he'd maintained for months. Behind him, he left Kyle standing in the stairwell with his mouth open and his friends looking uncertain. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by confusion and growing anxiety about what he had just agreed to. Word spread through Westfield High School like wildfire. By the end of first period, half the student body knew that the quiet transfer student had challenged Kyle Brennan to a fight. By lunch, the other half had heard variations of the story that grew more dramatic with each telling. Some students were excited to see Kyle finally tested by someone other than his usual victims. Others were planning to record what they assumed would be an inevitable beatdown of the smaller, quieter boy. Most were simply amazed that Marcus Rivera had found the courage to stand up for himself after months of systematic harassment. In chemistry class, Dr. Martinez noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor immediately. Where before the boy had seemed increasingly withdrawn and defeated, now he radiated a calm confidence that was both reassuring and slightly unsettling. Mr. Rivera, the teacher said after class, I heard about your disagreement with Mr. Brennan. I hope you're planning to handle this appropriately. Marcus met his gaze directly. I'm planning to defend myself, Dr. Martinez. What happens beyond that depends on how far they want to take it. The response was measured but carried an implication that made the teacher frown with concern. Perhaps we should involve the administration. With respect, sir, the administration has had months to address this situation. They've chosen not to see it. Dr. Martinez couldn't argue with that assessment. Kyle's harassment campaign had been systematic and obvious, yet somehow invisible to the school's official oversight. The fake social media profiles, the public humiliation, the way other students had been drawn into the persecution, all of it had occurred under the noses of teachers and administrators who seemed determined to look the other way. Just be careful, Marcus. Whatever's happening between you and Kyle, it's not worth ruining your future over. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. You're right, Dr. Martinez. It's not worth ruining my future. That's exactly why it has to end. The rest of the school day passed in a strange state of anticipation. Students who had never spoken to Marcus before approached him with questions, warnings, and unsolicited advice. Most seemed genuinely surprised that he was planning to fight Kyle, having assumed from his months of passive endurance that he was simply incapable of defending himself. You know Kyle's on the wrestling team, right? A concerned sophomore asked between classes. Are you sure about this? Asked another. He's got like 40 pounds on you. My brother says Kyle's never lost a fight, warned a third. Marcus listened to all of them with polite attention, but didn't engage in extended conversations. His mind was focused elsewhere, processing the tactical implications of what he had committed himself to doing. For months, he had maintained his cover as a harmless transfer student, hiding his training and capabilities behind a mask of quiet vulnerability. Tomorrow, that mask would come off permanently. Kyle, meanwhile, was struggling with the situation he found himself in. His friends assured him that Marcus posed no real threat, that the smaller boy had simply reached a breaking point and was acting irrationally. But something about Marcus's transformation in the stairwell had shaken Kyle's confidence. He's probably never been in a real fight, Jake assured him during lunch. You're going to destroy him. I know that, Kyle snapped, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "So why do you look worried?" Tommy asked. Kyle considered the question. Why was he worried? Marcus Rivera was smaller, lighter, and had no apparent fighting experience. By every logical measure, Kyle should dominate their confrontation easily. Yet something about the way Marcus had looked at him, the calm certainty in his voice when issuing the challenge, suggested depths that Kyle had never suspected. "I'm not worried," Kyle lied. "I just don't want to hurt him too badly. His parents might sue or something." But privately, Kyle found himself studying Marcus throughout the day, looking for signs of hidden strength or capability. The smaller boy moved with the same quiet grace he'd always displayed, but now Kyle noticed things he'd missed before: the perfect posture, the controlled breathing, the way Marcus seemed to be constantly aware of his surroundings without appearing paranoid. The final bell rang at 3:15, and by 3:30, word had spread that nearly 50 students were planning to gather in the parking lot behind the gymnasium. The space was hidden from the main school buildings by a line of trees, making it perfect for unofficial conflicts that administrators preferred not to see. Marcus arrived exactly on time, still wearing the same jeans and hoodie that had made him look harmless for months. He walked to the center of the designated area and waited, his hands at his sides, his breathing steady and controlled. Kyle showed up 5 minutes later with Jake and Tommy flanking him like bodyguards. He had changed into athletic shorts and a tank top, clearly expecting a physical confrontation that would require freedom of movement. The size difference was immediately apparent. Kyle had at least 6 inches and 40 pounds on Marcus, his football training evident in his broad shoulders and muscular frame. "Last chance to apologize, freak," Kyle called out as he approached, playing to the crowd that had gathered in a loose circle around them. "Say you're sorry for wasting everyone's time, and maybe I'll go easy on you." Marcus looked around at the assembled students, many with phones ready to record whatever was about to happen. He thought about months of harassment, systematic humiliation, and the fake social media profiles that had painted him as a dangerous psychopath. He thought about Amy Chen's forced schedule change and Dr. Martinez's warnings about perceived threats. Then he looked back at Kyle Brennan, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as an insurmountable obstacle or source of endless persecution, but simply as another opponent whose capabilities he would soon understand completely. "No," Marcus said simply, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Kyle's face darkened with anger and embarrassment. "Fine, have it your way." He rushed forward with the straightforward aggression that had intimidated smaller students for years, his plan simple and direct: grab Marcus, use his size advantage to throw him down, and let superior strength do the rest. Marcus saw him coming with the clarity that came from hundreds of hours of sparring against opponents of every size and skill level. As Kyle reached for him, Marcus stepped slightly aside and dropped his center of gravity, his movements so subtle that most observers didn't even notice them. Kyle's momentum carried him forward into empty air, and Marcus's hand shot out with snake-like precision to grab Kyle's wrist. What happened next was poetry in motion, executed with the kind of technical perfection that came from years of disciplined practice under expert guidance. Marcus pulled on Kyle's wrist while simultaneously stepping behind him and sweeping his lead leg. Kyle's feet went out from under him, and he found himself airborne for a brief, terrifying moment before crashing hard onto the asphalt. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent shockwaves through his back, leaving him gasping and disoriented. The crowd gasped collectively. Kyle Brennan had gone from aggressive attacker to flat on his back in less than 2 seconds, and Marcus Rivera was standing over him, perfectly balanced, not even breathing hard. "What the hell?" Kyle wheezed, struggling to process what had just happened to him. Marcus looked down at him with those same calm brown eyes that had seemed so harmless for months. "Get up." Kyle scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and growing rage. The crowd was murmuring with excitement and disbelief, phones capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most shocking upset in Westfield High School's social hierarchy. "You got lucky, you little..." Kyle swung a wild haymaker at Marcus's head, putting all his strength and frustration behind the punch. Marcus ducked under the blow smoothly, stepped inside Kyle's guard, and wrapped his arms around the bigger boy's waist. Before Kyle could react, Marcus had lifted him off his feet and driven him back down with a perfectly executed double-leg takedown that would have made his father proud. This time, Marcus followed Kyle to the ground, and the watching students suddenly found themselves witnessing something none of them had expected. This wasn't a bigger kid beating up a smaller one. This was a technical dismantling of everything Kyle Brennan thought he knew about fighting, strength, and dominance. Marcus secured side control, his weight distributed perfectly across Kyle's torso, making it impossible for the larger boy to bridge or roll. Kyle tried to push him off, bucking and thrashing with desperate strength, but Marcus moved with his efforts like water, flowing from position to position with an ease that spoke to years of advanced training. "Let me up," Kyle grunted, his voice tight with panic as he realized he couldn't move the smaller boy despite his size advantage. "Are you going to leave me alone?" Marcus asked calmly, maintaining perfect control while Kyle exhausted himself with futile struggles. "Screw you!" Marcus transitioned smoothly to mount, settling his weight across Kyle's hips in a position that any experienced grappler would recognize as completely dominant. Kyle bucked and thrashed even more desperately, but Marcus rode out every movement with the kind of effortless control that came from thousands of hours of practice against resistant opponents. The crowd had fallen silent, stunned by the complete reversal of their expectations. Kyle Brennan, the undisputed king of their social hierarchy, was being controlled and dominated by the quiet transfer student they had all dismissed as harmless. Jake Morrison, watching his friend get systematically dismantled, decided to intervene. "Get off him!" he shouted, rushing toward the fight with the intention of kicking Marcus while he was occupied with Kyle. Marcus saw him coming in his peripheral vision, and without releasing his control of Kyle, he shifted his weight and caught Jake's ankle as the wrestler attempted to deliver a kick. A simple twist and pull sent Jake crashing to the ground beside them, where Marcus immediately trapped him in a triangle choke, using his legs while maintaining his dominant position over Kyle with his arms. Now both bullies were trapped, Jake's air supply being systematically cut off, while Kyle remained pinned and helpless beneath Marcus's compact frame. The crowd stared in amazement as Marcus controlled both larger opponents simultaneously, demonstrating a level of skill that none of them had thought possible. "Holy crap," someone whispered. "He's got both of them." Tommy Chen took a step forward, apparently considering joining the fight, but stopped when Marcus's cold gaze fixed on him. Something in those brown eyes promised that there was room for one more if Tommy wanted to test his luck, and the basketball player wisely decided to stay where he was. Jake was beginning to turn red from the choke, his hands clawing desperately at Marcus's legs as his oxygen supply was restricted. Marcus held the submission for a few more seconds, long enough to make his point clear, then released it. Jake rolled away, gasping and coughing, his face flushed with embarrassment and oxygen deprivation. Kyle had stopped struggling, staring up at Marcus with shock and growing fear. "How are you doing this?" he whispered. Marcus looked down at him with an expression that carried months of suppressed frustration and anger. 8 years of Brazilian jiu-jitsu," he said conversationally. "My father is Roberto Rivera. Maybe you've heard of him." Several students immediately pulled out their phones, and within seconds someone called out, "Holy crap, his dad's the Snake Rivera. He submitted 3 guys in the first round during his UFC title run." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a shockwave, recontextualizing everything they thought they knew about Marcus Rivera. He wasn't just some quiet transfer student, he was the son of a professional fighter, trained from childhood in one of the most effective martial arts ever developed. Kyle's face had gone pale beneath Marcus's weight. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Marcus replied, his voice still calm but carrying years of suppressed frustration. "You never bothered to know anything about me. You just saw someone quiet and small and decided I'd make a good target." He leaned closer, his voice dropping so only Kyle could hear. "But here's what you're going to learn today. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak, and being small doesn't mean being helpless." Marcus stood up smoothly, releasing Kyle entirely. The bigger boy scrambled backward on his hands and knees, putting distance between himself and this person who had just completely upended his understanding of the world. "This is over," Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "Anyone who has a problem with me can discuss it face to face, like a human being. Anyone who thinks they can bully me or anyone else at this school." He looked directly at Jake, who was still coughing and holding his throat. "Well, you've seen what happens." Marcus picked up his backpack and started walking toward the school building, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. Behind him, Kyle struggled to his feet, his clothes dirty and his dignity in shambles. Around him, students were still recording, still taking pictures, still processing the complete destruction of the social order they had thought was permanent. "Wait!" The voice was Kyle's, cracking with emotion and exhaustion. Marcus turned back, one eyebrow raised in question. Kyle stood there, surrounded by the evidence of his humiliation, looking around at the crowd that had watched him be systematically dominated by someone they had all dismissed as harmless. Tomorrow, everyone at Westfield High School would know exactly what had happened. The videos would spread through social media, the story would grow in the telling, and Kyle Brennan's reputation as an untouchable predator would be destroyed forever. Kyle started, then stopped. He looked around at the crowd, at his friends who were avoiding his gaze, at the girl he'd been trying to impress who was looking at him with something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything. The tripping, the names, all of it. I was just..." "You were just being a bully," Marcus said simply. "But you can choose to be something else." He turned and walked away, leaving Kyle standing in the parking lot surrounded by the scattered pieces of his former reputation. The transformation was complete. The mouse had revealed himself to be a lion, and nothing at Westfield High School would ever be the same again. As Marcus reached the edge of the parking lot, he allowed himself a small smile. For months, he had endured harassment, humiliation, and systematic persecution while maintaining his commitment to peaceful resolution. But sometimes, as his father had taught him, the only way to achieve peace was to demonstrate that you were capable of war. The choice to fight had been Kyle's, made through months of escalating cruelty and psychological warfare. Marcus had simply chosen to win it as quickly and decisively as possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dynamics, and new relationships. But tonight, for the first time in months, Marcus Rivera would sleep peacefully, knowing that his nightmare at Westfield High School was finally over. The autumn air carried a crisp bite that seemed to electrify the atmosphere around Westfield High School as students began filtering toward the parking lot behind the gymnasium. Word had spread through the halls like wildfire throughout the day, whispered conversations in classrooms, hurried text messages between classes, and excited discussions in the cafeteria. By 3:30, nearly 50 students had gathered in the secluded area, their breath visible in small puffs as they formed a loose circle around the designated space. The parking lot was perfect for what everyone knew was about to unfold. Hidden from the main school buildings by a thick line of maple and oak trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, it provided privacy from administrative oversight while offering enough space for whatever was about to happen. The asphalt was old and cracked, scattered with fallen leaves that crunched underfoot as students positioned themselves for the best view. Marcus Rivera arrived at exactly 3:30, his punctuality as precise as everything else about him. He wore the same clothes he'd had on all day, a pair of dark jeans that fit him well but weren't tight, a black hoodie that concealed his compact frame, and worn sneakers that had seen countless training sessions. To the gathered crowd, he looked exactly as he had for months, small, quiet, unremarkable. Just another skinny kid who was about to learn a harsh lesson about challenging the established social order. But to those who knew what to look for, everything about Marcus's approach suggested controlled readiness. His breathing was deep and steady, his posture relaxed but alert, his movements flowing with an economy of motion that spoke to years of disciplined training. His hands hung loose at his sides, but his fingers were slightly curved, ready to grasp or strike if necessary. Most tellingly, his eyes constantly scanned the environment, noting escape routes, potential weapons, and the positioning of every person in the growing crowd. "Can't believe he actually showed up," whispered a sophomore girl to her friend. "I thought for sure he'd chicken out." "Kyle's going to murder him," replied another student, his phone already recording. "This is going to be epic." Marcus ignored the comments, walking to the center of the clearing and stopping. He set his backpack down carefully, positioning it where it wouldn't interfere with movement, but could be retrieved quickly if necessary. Then he simply waited, his breathing controlled, his mind entering the calm, focused state that his father had drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. Kyle Brennan arrived 5 minutes later, and his entrance was clearly calculated for maximum psychological impact. He had changed out of his school clothes into athletic shorts that showed off his muscular legs and a tight tank top that emphasized his broad shoulders and well-developed chest. Jake Morrison and Tommy Chen flanked him like bodyguards, their presence lending additional intimidation to what was already an imposing sight. The size difference was immediately apparent to everyone present. Kyle stood at least 6'2" and weighed perhaps 170 pounds, his football training evident in every line of his powerful frame. His thick blonde hair caught the afternoon light, and his confident stride spoke to years of athletic success and social dominance. Beside him, Jake looked like a compact bulldozer, all muscle and barely contained aggression, while Tommy's basketball-honed height gave their group an air of overwhelming physical superiority. "Look at that," Jake said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, gesturing toward Marcus. "Kid didn't even bother changing clothes. Guess he knows this won't take long." Tommy laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "Maybe he figures his regular clothes will be fine for getting his ass kicked." Kyle raised a hand, silencing his friends with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He walked toward Marcus with deliberate slowness, playing to the audience that had gathered to witness what everyone assumed would be his easy victory over the school's most persistent target. "Well, well," Kyle called out, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "I have to admit, Mouse, I didn't think you'd actually show up. Thought you might come to your senses and realize what a stupid idea this was." Marcus said nothing, simply watched Kyle approach with those same calm brown eyes that had absorbed months of harassment without retaliation. His silence seemed to unsettle Kyle slightly, who had clearly expected some kind of response, some sign of fear or bravado that he could work with. "Last chance to apologize, freak," Kyle continued, stopping about 10 feet away from Marcus. "Say you're sorry for wasting everyone's time, and maybe I'll go easy on you. Maybe I'll only embarrass you a little bit instead of putting you in the hospital." The crowd stirred with anticipation. Several students had their phones out, recording what they expected to be Kyle's greatest performance yet. Others placed quiet bets on how quickly the fight would end, with most estimates falling between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. Marcus looked around at the assembled faces, seeing excitement, bloodlust, and morbid curiosity in equal measure. These were his classmates, people he sat near in classes and passed in hallways, but in this moment they seemed more like spectators at a gladiatorial contest, hungry for violence and humiliation. "Well?" Kyle demanded, his voice rising with frustration at Marcus's continued silence. "Are you going to apologize or not?" Marcus met his gaze directly, and for a moment the two 17-year-olds stared at each other across the 10 feet of cracked asphalt that separated them. In Kyle's blue eyes, Marcus saw arrogance, anger, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having faced serious consequences for his actions. In Marcus's brown eyes, Kyle saw something that made him suddenly uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "No," Marcus said simply, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. Kyle's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The simple rejection, delivered without drama or explanation, somehow felt more insulting than any elaborate insult could have been. Around them, the crowd stirred with anticipation, sensing that words were about to give way to action. "Fine," Kyle snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Have it your way." Kyle rushed forward with the kind of straightforward aggression that had served him well throughout his athletic career. His plan was simple and had worked countless times before. Use his size and strength advantage to overwhelm his opponent, grab him, throw him down, and let superior physicality do the rest. It was the approach of someone who had never faced a truly skilled opponent, someone whose victories had always come through pure dominance rather than technique. Marcus saw the attack coming with crystal clarity, his mind automatically analyzing Kyle's approach and identifying weaknesses with the precision of a computer. Kyle was moving too fast, his balance forward-weighted, his hands positioned wrong for grappling. He was telegraphing his intentions clearly, making his attack predictable and easily countered. As Kyle reached for him, Marcus stepped slightly to his left and dropped his center of gravity about 2 inches. The movement was so subtle that most of the watching crowd didn't even notice it, but it was perfectly timed and positioned. Kyle's momentum carried him forward into empty air, his grasping hands finding nothing but space where Marcus had been a split second before. Marcus's right hand shot out with snake-like precision, wrapping around Kyle's extended wrist in a grip that felt like steel cable. His left hand came up to Kyle's elbow, and suddenly Kyle found himself trapped in a basic but perfectly executed grip that controlled his entire right arm. What happened next was pure poetry in motion, 8 years of Brazilian jiu-jitsu training condensed into 3 seconds of technical perfection. Marcus pulled down on Kyle's wrist while simultaneously stepping behind him with his right foot, his left leg sweeping Kyle's lead foot in a motion so smooth it looked almost choreographed. Kyle's feet went out from under him, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he found himself completely airborne, his body horizontal to the ground with nothing beneath him but cracked asphalt. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced, the complete loss of control, the helpless feeling of being manipulated by forces he didn't understand. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a whoosh that was audible to the entire crowd. The back of his head bounced off the asphalt with a sound that made several students wince, and pain shot through his spine as his full weight crashed down onto the unforgiving surface. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound of shock and disbelief that echoed off the surrounding trees. Kyle Brennan, the undisputed alpha of Westfield High School's social hierarchy, had gone from aggressive attacker to flat on his back in less than 3 seconds. And Marcus Rivera, the quiet mouse they had all dismissed as harmless, was standing over him perfectly balanced, not even breathing hard, looking like he had just performed the most natural movement in the world. "What the hell?" Kyle wheezed, struggling to process what had just happened to him. His vision was slightly blurred from the impact, and his back felt like it was on fire. This wasn't how fights were supposed to go. This wasn't how anything in his life was supposed to go. Marcus looked down at him with those same calm brown eyes, his expression showing neither satisfaction nor anger, just a kind of professional assessment. "Get up," he said quietly. Kyle rolled onto his side, gasping for air and trying to clear his head. Around him, he could hear the murmur of excited conversation from the crowd, phones clicking as pictures were taken, whispered commentary about what they had just witnessed. "Holy shit, did you see that? Where did that come from?" Kyle got dropped like a sack of potatoes. The humiliation burned in Kyle's chest, worse than the physical pain. He had been dominated, completely and utterly, in front of 50 of his peers. Videos of his defeat were already being recorded, probably being uploaded to social media as he struggled to regain his breath. His reputation, carefully built over years of athletic success and social manipulation, was crumbling in real time. Kyle pushed himself to his feet, his movements unsteady and his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. His tank top was torn and dirty, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his confident demeanor completely shattered. But rather than retreating or reconsidering his approach, the humiliation only fed his anger. "You got lucky, you little piece of shit," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "That won't happen again." Marcus said nothing, simply watched as Kyle regained his footing and began circling like an angry predator. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the real fight was just beginning, their excitement palpable in the crisp afternoon air. Kyle took a deep breath, trying to center himself and think tactically. He was bigger, stronger, and more athletic than Marcus. One lucky technique didn't change the fundamental physical realities of their confrontation. He just needed to be smarter, more careful, more aggressive. Without warning, Kyle launched himself forward again, but this time he led with a wild haymaker punch aimed directly at Marcus's head. He put everything behind the blow, all his strength, all his frustration, all his rage at being humiliated in front of his peers. If he could just connect with that punch, he could end this fight and salvage his reputation. Marcus saw the punch coming from a mile away. Kyle's shoulder dropped before he threw it, his weight shifted noticeably to his right side, and his face telegraphed his intentions as clearly as if he had announced them verbally. To someone trained to read and react to attacks, Kyle might as well have been moving in slow motion. Marcus ducked under the haymaker smoothly, his head moving just far enough to avoid the blow while keeping himself in perfect position for a counterattack. As Kyle's fist whistled harmlessly through the air above him, Marcus stepped inside his guard and wrapped both arms around Kyle's waist in a classic double-leg takedown setup. Before Kyle could react, Marcus had lifted him completely off his feet. For a moment, Kyle found himself airborne again, this time horizontal and moving backward as Marcus drove him away from the center of the circle. The sensation was even more terrifying than the first takedown because this time he could see it coming, could feel himself being completely controlled by someone half his size. Marcus slammed Kyle down onto the asphalt with authority, the impact echoing across the parking lot like a gunshot. But this time, instead of stepping back and allowing Kyle to recover, Marcus followed him to the ground, his compact frame settling into side control with the kind of technical precision that spoke to thousands of hours of practice. The watching students suddenly found themselves witnessing something they had never seen before and didn't fully understand. This wasn't a typical high school fight with wild swinging and chaotic grappling. This was systematic domination, a technical dismantling performed by someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. Marcus distributed his weight perfectly across Kyle's torso, his right arm threading under Kyle's neck, while his left hand controlled Kyle's far hip. His legs were positioned to prevent Kyle from turning toward him or rolling away, creating a position that any experienced grappler would recognize as completely dominant. Kyle tried to push Marcus off, using his superior size and strength to buck and bridge with desperate fury. But Marcus moved with his efforts like water, flowing from position to position while maintaining perfect control. Every time Kyle tried to create space, Marcus closed it. Every time Kyle attempted to turn or roll, Marcus anticipated the movement and countered it effortlessly. "Let me up!" Kyle grunted, his voice tight with panic as he realized that despite his size advantage, he couldn't move the smaller boy even an inch. "Get off me, you freak!" "Are you going to leave me alone?" Marcus asked calmly, his voice barely elevated despite the physical exertion of controlling a larger, stronger opponent who was fighting with desperate intensity. "Screw you!" Kyle snarled, bucking even more violently. Marcus sighed slightly, as if Kyle's response was disappointing but not unexpected. With fluid grace, he transitioned from side control to mount, settling his weight across Kyle's hips in a position that was even more dominant and controlling. From mount, Marcus could rain down punches if he chose to, but he simply sat there, perfectly balanced, making it clear that Kyle's attempts to escape were not only futile, but barely worth acknowledging. Kyle thrashed beneath him like a pinned insect, his face growing red with exertion and humiliation. The crowd had fallen completely silent, stunned by what they were witnessing. Kyle Brennan, the undisputed king of their social hierarchy, was being systematically controlled and dominated by the quiet transfer student they had all dismissed as harmless. The complete reversal of their expectations was so shocking that many struggled to process what they were seeing. "This is impossible," whispered a junior girl who had been dating one of Kyle's teammates. "Kyle's the strongest guy in school." "Strength doesn't matter if you don't know how to use it," replied David Kim, a shy sophomore who had been one of Kyle's previous targets. "This Marcus guy clearly knows what he's doing." Jake Morrison, watching his best friend and leader get systematically dismantled, felt his own reputation and sense of reality crumbling. If Kyle could be dominated this easily, what did that say about the social order they had all accepted as natural law? What did it say about his own position in that hierarchy? "Get off him!" Jake shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "This isn't fair! It's supposed to be one-on-one!" But as he watched Marcus maintain perfect control over Kyle's increasingly desperate struggles, Jake realized that fairness had nothing to do with what was happening. This was skill defeating size, technique overwhelming strength, preparation conquering improvisation. Jake made his decision in a moment of panic and loyalty. He couldn't watch his best friend be humiliated without doing something, even if it meant breaking the unspoken rules of their confrontation. With a growl of rage, he rushed toward the fight, his wrestler's instincts telling him to deliver a kick to Marcus's ribs, while the smaller boy was occupied with controlling Kyle. Marcus saw him coming in his peripheral vision, and without releasing his dominant position over Kyle, he shifted his weight slightly to his left. As Jake's foot came toward his ribs, in what would have been a devastating kick, Marcus caught the incoming leg with his right hand, wrapping his fingers around Jake's ankle with iron grip strength. What happened next was so smooth and technically perfect that several students watching would later claim it looked like something from a martial arts movie. Marcus twisted Jake's ankle while pulling down sharply, using the wrestler's own momentum and balance against him. Jake's supporting leg went out from under him, and he crashed to the ground beside Kyle and Marcus with a thud that knocked the wind out of him. But Marcus wasn't finished. As Jake lay stunned beside them, Marcus adjusted his position and wrapped his legs around Jake's neck and arm in a perfect triangle choke. Now he was simultaneously controlling Kyle with his upper body while cutting off Jake's blood flow with his legs, demonstrating a level of technical skill that none of the watching students had thought possible. "Holy crap," someone breathed. "He's got both of them." The crowd stared in amazement as Marcus controlled both larger opponents simultaneously, his face showing the same calm concentration he might display while working on a difficult math problem. Kyle was still trapped beneath his weight, unable to create any meaningful movement, while Jake's face was beginning to turn red as the triangle choke restricted the blood flow to his brain. Tommy Chen, the third member of Kyle's inner circle, took a step forward as if to join the fight. But when Marcus's gaze fixed on him, something in those brown eyes made Tommy freeze in place. There was no anger in Marcus's expression, no hatred or excitement about the violence he was inflicting. There was only calm, professional assessment, the look of someone who was completely in control of the situation and ready to handle whatever came next. The message was clear. There was room for one more if Tommy wanted to test his luck, but he should understand that he would receive the same systematic dismantling that his friends were currently experiencing. Tommy wisely decided to stay where he was. Jake's struggles were becoming weaker as the choke took effect, his hands clawing desperately at Marcus's legs, but unable to create enough space to relieve the pressure. His face had progressed from red to purple, and his eyes were beginning to take on the glassy look that preceded unconsciousness. Marcus held the submission for a few more seconds, long enough to make his point absolutely clear, then released the triangle. Jake rolled away immediately, gasping and coughing as oxygen rushed back to his brain. His face was flushed with embarrassment as much as oxygen deprivation, the humiliation of being so easily controlled burning worse than the physical discomfort of the choke. Kyle had stopped struggling beneath Marcus, staring up at the smaller boy with a mixture of shock, fear, and growing understanding. This wasn't random luck or desperate flailing. This was systematic application of advanced martial arts techniques by someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. "How are you doing this?" Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus looked down at him, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, his calm expression showed a hint of the frustration and anger that had been building for months. 8 years of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, he said, his voice conversational but carrying an edge that made Kyle flinch. "My father is Roberto Rivera. Maybe you've heard of him." The name hit the crowd like a physical force. Several students immediately pulled out their phones, fingers flying over touchscreens as they searched for information. Within seconds, the first student found what he was looking for. "Holy shit!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "His dad's the Snake Rivera. He fought in the UFC for 6 years. He submitted 3 guys in the first round during his title run," another student added, reading from her phone. "He's like a legend in mixed martial arts." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a shockwave, completely recontextualizing everything they thought they knew about Marcus Rivera. He wasn't just some quiet transfer student who had gotten lucky. He was the son of a professional fighter, trained from childhood in one of the most effective martial arts ever developed. Suddenly, his months of passive endurance made sense in a completely different way. He hadn't been absorbing Kyle's harassment because he was weak or unable to defend himself. He had been choosing not to fight, showing restraint that none of them had recognized or appreciated. Kyle's face had gone pale beneath Marcus's weight, the implications of the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Marcus replied, his voice still calm, but now carrying months of suppressed frustration and anger. "You never bothered to know anything about me. You just saw someone quiet and small and decided I'd make a good target." He leaned closer, his voice dropping so that only Kyle could hear, despite the crowd pressing in around them. "But here's what you're going to learn today. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak, and being small doesn't mean being helpless." Marcus's words carried the weight of months of accumulated harassment, humiliation, and psychological torture. Every shoulder check in the hallway, every mocking comment in class, every fake social media post designed to destroy his reputation, all of it had been endured by someone who could have ended Kyle's campaign of cruelty at any time. "You see," Marcus continued, his voice taking on an educational tone that somehow made his words more threatening than any shouted curse would have been, "my father taught me that a true warrior doesn't fight to prove himself. He fights only when fighting is the only option left. Kyle swallowed hard, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. You could have done this any time. I could have done this the first day you decided to make me your target, Marcus confirmed. I chose not to. I hoped you would eventually get bored and move on to something else. But you didn't, did you? You just kept escalating, kept pushing, kept trying to destroy me piece by piece. Around them, the crowd listened in fascination to this glimpse into the psychology of their confrontation. Many students were beginning to feel uncomfortable as they realized they had been witnessing not just bullying, but systematic persecution of someone who had been showing remarkable restraint. The fake social media profiles were particularly creative, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, painting me as a potential school shooter, making other students afraid of me, trying to get me suspended or arrested for things I never said or did. That crossed a line, Kyle. That wasn't just harassment anymore. That was attempting to destroy my life. Kyle's breathing was becoming shallow as the full weight of his actions and their consequences became clear. He had pushed and pushed, interpreting Marcus's restraint as weakness, never considering that there might be consequences for his behavior. "I'm sorry," Kyle whispered, the words barely audible. "I know you are," Marcus replied, "but sorry doesn't undo months of systematic harassment. Sorry doesn't repair the damage to my reputation or give me back the sleep I lost, worrying about what you would do next." He paused, looking around at the crowd of students who had gathered to watch his humiliation, many of whom were still recording every moment of the confrontation. "But it's a start," Marcus concluded. With fluid grace, Marcus rose from his dominant position, releasing Kyle entirely and stepping back. The bigger boy scrambled backward on his hands and knees, putting distance between himself and this person who had just completely upended his understanding of power, strength, and social hierarchy. "This is over," Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "Anyone who has a problem with me can discuss it face to face, like a human being. Anyone who thinks they can bully me or anyone else at this school." His gaze swept across the assembled students, making eye contact with several who had participated in sharing the fake social media posts or joining in the harassment campaign. Many looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with their role in what they were beginning to understand had been systematic persecution. "Well," Marcus concluded, looking directly at Jake, who was still coughing and holding his throat, "you've seen what happens." Marcus picked up his backpack and started walking toward the school building, his movements flowing with the same controlled grace that had characterized his fighting. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, students stepping aside with expressions of newfound respect and wariness. Behind him, Kyle struggled to his feet, his clothes dirty and torn, his carefully maintained image completely shattered. Around him, students were still recording, still taking pictures, still processing the complete destruction of the social order they had thought was permanent. "Wait," Kyle called out, his voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. Marcus paused and turned back, one eyebrow raised in polite inquiry. Kyle stood there among the scattered pieces of his former reputation, looking around at the crowd that had watched him be systematically dominated by someone they had all dismissed as harmless. Tomorrow, everyone at Westfield High School would know exactly what had happened. The videos would spread through social media, the story would grow in the telling, and Kyle Brennan's reputation as an untouchable predator would be destroyed forever. But looking at Marcus now, seeing the calm control and technical skill he had displayed, Kyle began to understand that his humiliation was entirely self-inflicted. He had chosen to target someone based on superficial impressions, never bothering to learn who Marcus really was or what he was capable of. He had escalated the harassment systematically, interpreting restraint as weakness and kindness as opportunity. Most damning of all, he had enjoyed it. He had taken pleasure in Marcus's apparent helplessness, had fed off the psychological torture he was inflicting, had turned the systematic destruction of another human being into entertainment for himself and his friends. Kyle started, then stopped. He looked around at the crowd, at his friends who were avoiding his gaze, at the girl he had been trying to impress, who was looking at him with something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything, the tripping, the names, the fake posts, all of it. You were just being a bully," Marcus said simply, his voice carrying no anger or satisfaction, just a kind of tired acceptance. "But you can choose to be something else." The words hit Kyle harder than any physical blow could have. Marcus wasn't gloating over his victory or demanding further submission. He was offering redemption, the possibility of change, the chance to become someone better than the person he had been. "How?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Start by apologizing to everyone you've hurt, not just me. All of them, every student you've targeted, every person you've made feel small or worthless or afraid. Look them in the eye and tell them you were wrong." Kyle nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "Then figure out why you felt the need to hurt people in the first place," Marcus continued. "What was missing in your life that you thought you could fill by making others miserable? Because that's not strength, Kyle. That's weakness, and until you understand that, you'll just keep repeating the same patterns." The crowd listened in fascination to this unexpected lesson in psychology and personal growth. Many had expected Marcus to continue his domination, to humiliate Kyle further, or demand some kind of tribute. Instead, he was offering wisdom and the possibility of genuine change. "And if some of them don't want to forgive you?" Kyle asked. "Then you live with that," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "That's part of being accountable for your choices. Some damage can't be undone, some relationships can't be repaired. You have to accept that and do better going forward." Kyle stood there, processing the weight of what Marcus was telling him. The easy dominance he had enjoyed for years was gone forever, but in its place was the possibility of becoming someone worthy of genuine respect, rather than fear-based submission. "Thank you," Kyle said finally, and for the first time in months, he sounded like a human being rather than a predator. Marcus nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving Kyle standing in the parking lot, surrounded by the evidence of his former cruelty and the possibility of his future redemption. As Marcus reached the edge of the parking lot, he could hear the excited conversations erupting behind him, students processing what they had just witnessed and sharing their amazement at the complete reversal of their expectations. Some were already Googling his father's fighting career, discovering videos of Roberto Rivera's UFC highlights and sharing them with friends. But Marcus felt no satisfaction in their newfound respect or interest. He had never wanted to be known as the son of a famous fighter or feared for his combat skills. He had simply wanted to attend school in peace, to focus on his education and prepare for his future without constantly looking over his shoulder for the next attack. Now that peace was finally within reach, but it had come at a cost, his cover as a harmless transfer student was blown forever. Students and teachers would now see him through the lens of his fighting ability, and he would need to navigate the social complexities that came with being known as someone dangerous. As he walked across the school parking lot toward the street that would take him home, Marcus reflected on his father's teachings about the warrior's path. Roberto had always emphasized that true strength meant protecting others, not dominating them. He had taught Marcus that violence should be a last resort, used only when all other options had been exhausted. Today, all other options had finally been exhausted. Kyle's escalating campaign of harassment had reached the point where it threatened not just Marcus's psychological well-being, but his future prospects. The fake social media profiles and fabricated threats could have resulted in criminal charges, federal investigation, and permanent damage to his reputation and opportunities. In defending himself, Marcus had also defended every other student who might become Kyle's target in the future. He had demonstrated that bullies were not invulnerable, that their power came from the assumption that their victims couldn't or wouldn't fight back. Most importantly, he had done it without causing permanent damage to his opponents. Kyle and Jake would be sore and humiliated, but they would recover physically. Whether they chose to grow from the experience or simply find new targets remained to be seen. As Marcus turned onto Elm Street and saw his house in the distance, he allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in months, he was walking home without constantly checking over his shoulder, without wondering what new humiliation awaited him tomorrow, without the crushing weight of systematic persecution bearing down on his shoulders. Tonight, he would train with his father in their garage gym, working through techniques and discussing the tactical aspects of the confrontation. Roberto would be proud of his son's restraint and control, even while acknowledging the necessity of what had finally occurred. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dynamics at Westfield High School. Students would approach him differently. Teachers would view him through a new lens, and the entire social hierarchy would need to adjust to the reality that the quiet transfer student was actually one of the most dangerous people in the building. But tonight, Marcus Rivera would sleep peacefully for the first time in months, knowing that his nightmare was finally over and that he had emerged from it with his principles and his character intact. The mouse had revealed himself to be a lion, but more importantly, he had chosen to be a protector rather than a predator. In the end, that choice would define him far more than his fighting skills ever could. The transformation of Westfield High School began before Marcus Rivera even reached the main building. As he walked across the parking lot, leaving behind the scattered remnants of Kyle Brennan's social empire, students who had witnessed the confrontation were already pulling out their phones, fingers flying across touchscreens as they shared videos, photos, and breathless accounts of what they had just seen. "Did you see that takedown? It was like something out of a movie. Kyle got absolutely destroyed. I can't believe it. His dad's a UFC fighter, Roberto the Snake Rivera. Look him up." The news spread through social media with viral intensity. By the time Marcus reached his front door on Elm Street, the first videos were already being shared beyond Westfield's student body, reaching friends and family members throughout the community. The quiet transfer student who had endured months of systematic harassment had revealed himself to be the son of a professional fighter, and his technical dismantling of the school's most feared bully was already becoming legendary. But for Marcus, the immediate aftermath felt strangely anticlimactic. He entered his house to find his parents in the kitchen, their expressions shifting to concern as they took in his slightly disheveled appearance and the tension still radiating from his compact frame. "How did it go, mijo?" Roberto asked quietly, though his experienced eye had already assessed his son's condition and concluded that Marcus had emerged victorious and largely unharmed. "It's over," Marcus replied simply, accepting the glass of water his mother offered. "Kyle won't be bothering me anymore." Elena Rivera studied her son's face with a mother's intuition. "And how do you feel about what happened?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Relieved, mostly, and a little sad." "Sad?" Roberto raised an eyebrow. That it had to come to that. That Kyle couldn't find another way to feel good about himself without trying to destroy other people. Roberto nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather used to say that a warrior's greatest victory is the one that teaches his enemy to become a better person." The next morning brought a completely different experience for Marcus as he approached Westfield High School. Students who had previously looked through him as if he were invisible now turned to watch his approach, their expressions a mixture of respect, curiosity, and wariness. Conversations stopped as he passed, replaced by whispered exchanges and pointing fingers. "That's him. That's the guy who beat Kyle Brennan. My older brother showed me the video. It was insane. I heard his dad fought in the UFC." Marcus maintained his usual measured pace and calm demeanor, but internally he was adjusting to the radical shift in his social environment. Where once he had been the invisible target of systematic harassment, now he was the center of attention, his every movement scrutinized and discussed. At his locker, he was approached by David Kim, a thin sophomore who had been one of Kyle's previous targets. David's face bore the nervous expression of someone working up courage for an important conversation. "Excuse me," David said quietly, glancing around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "I wanted to thank you." Marcus looked up from organizing his books. "Thank me for what?" "For what you did yesterday. Kyle and his friends, they've been making my life hell for 2 years, pushing me around, taking my lunch money, posting embarrassing pictures of me online." David's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But after what happened yesterday, they haven't even looked at me. It's like they're afraid to start anything because they know you're here now." Marcus felt a weight settle on his shoulders that had nothing to do with his backpack. "David, I didn't do what I did to become anyone's protector. I just wanted Kyle to leave me alone." "I know," David replied quickly, "but the effect is the same. You showed everyone that bullies aren't invulnerable, that someone can stand up to them and win." Before Marcus could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the hallway, her expression mixing relief with concern. "Mr. Rivera, could I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus followed his mathematics teacher to a quiet corner of the hallway, noting how other students watched their interaction with intense interest. "I heard about what happened yesterday," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "I want you to know that while I can't officially condone fighting, I'm glad you're safe. And I'm sorry that the situation escalated to that point." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I also want you to know that several teachers have been discussing how we might have handled Kyle's behavior more effectively. Your confrontation has opened some eyes about problems we should have addressed long ago." Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. His fight with Kyle hadn't just changed the student social hierarchy, it had forced the adult authority figures to confront their own failures in maintaining a safe educational environment. The first real test of the new order came during second period American literature. Kyle entered the classroom with obvious reluctance, his usual confident swagger replaced by subdued movements and downcast eyes. His face still bore faint bruises from their confrontation, and his torn Letterman jacket had been replaced with a plain hoodie that made him look smaller and more vulnerable. When Kyle's eyes met Marcus's across the classroom, something passed between them that the other students couldn't quite interpret. There was no anger or hostility, but there was a recognition of changed circumstances, of power structures that had been permanently altered. "Kyle," Mr. Kowalski called out as the class settled into their seats, "would you like to continue our discussion of moral redemption in The Great Gatsby?" Kyle's face flushed slightly at the literary irony, but he cleared his throat and attempted to participate. Gatsby believes he can recreate his past, become someone worthy of Daisy's love, but his methods are problematic. "How so?" the teacher prompted. Kyle glanced unconsciously toward Marcus before answering. "He builds his entire new identity on lies and illegal activities. He thinks he can become a better person without actually confronting what was wrong with him in the first place." The insight was more profound than Kyle had probably intended, and several students exchanged meaningful looks. Mr. Kowalski nodded approvingly, seemingly unaware of the deeper layers of meaning in Kyle's response. After class, Kyle approached Marcus with obvious nervousness. Could I talk to you for a minute?" Marcus gathered his books and nodded, following Kyle to a relatively private corner of the hallway. Several students watched their interaction with fascination, but Kyle seemed focused entirely on the conversation he needed to have. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Kyle began, his voice lacking any trace of his former arrogance, "about choosing to be something else, and about apologizing to the people I've hurt." Marcus waited patiently, saying nothing. "I wanted to start with you," Kyle continued. "I know saying sorry doesn't undo everything I did, but I need to say it anyway. I was wrong, not just about targeting you, but about the way I've treated people for years. I turned being cruel into entertainment, and I convinced myself it was just harmless fun." "What changed your mind?" Marcus asked. Kyle was quiet for a moment, apparently struggling with how to articulate his thoughts. "Yesterday, when you had me pinned and helpless, I realized that was how I'd been making other people feel for years. Powerless, humiliated, afraid." He looked directly at Marcus. "I don't want to be the kind of person who enjoys making others suffer." Marcus studied Kyle's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but what he saw was genuine remorse and the kind of uncomfortable self-awareness that came from having one's worldview forcibly restructured. "Apologizing to me is just the beginning," Marcus said finally. "There are a lot of people in this school who have been hurt by your behavior." "I know. I made a list." Kyle pulled out a folded piece of paper. 37 names. Students I can remember targeting or humiliating over the past 3 years. Marcus raised an eyebrow. 37? "Probably more that I'm forgetting," Kyle admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "I never really thought about them as individuals before. They were just targets, entertainment." The conversation was interrupted by Jake Morrison's approach. Kyle's former lieutenant looked nervous and uncertain, clearly struggling with the dramatic shift in social dynamics. "Kyle," Jake said quietly, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday." Kyle's expression hardened slightly. "What about it?" "People are saying you lost because you went soft. That if you'd really wanted to hurt him, you could have won." Jake's voice carried a hint of his old aggressive confidence. "Maybe we should try again, but this time—" "No," Kyle interrupted firmly. "There won't be a this time. What happened yesterday was my fault, and I deserved what I got." Jake's face showed confusion and growing anger. "What's wrong with you? That little freak humiliated you in front of the whole school. Aren't you pissed?" Kyle looked between Jake and Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression. Part of him probably was angry about the humiliation, wanted to strike back at the person who had destroyed his carefully constructed social dominance. But another part of him recognized that his humiliation had been entirely self-inflicted. "I'm angry at myself," Kyle said finally, "for creating a situation where fighting was the only solution, for spending years hurting people who didn't deserve it, for becoming someone I don't want to be." Jake stared at him in disbelief. "He really messed you up, didn't he? This isn't you talking. This is like guilt or something." "Maybe guilt is what I needed," Kyle replied. "Maybe feeling bad about hurting people is better than feeling good about it." Jake looked between Kyle and Marcus with growing alarm, apparently realizing that his friend's transformation was genuine and permanent. "Fine," he said finally, "but don't expect me to apologize to anyone. I'm not the one who lost." He walked away, leaving Kyle and Marcus alone again. Kyle watched his former friend's departure with something that might have been sadness. "He'll come around," Marcus observed. "Maybe. Or maybe he'll find new friends who think the way he does." Kyle folded the paper with his list of names. "Either way, I can't control what he does. I can only control what I do." Over the following weeks, Westfield High School settled into its new equilibrium. Kyle kept his word, seeking out the students on his list and offering sincere apologies for his past behavior. The reactions varied widely. Some accepted his apologies gratefully, others rejected them with justified anger, and a few seemed suspicious of his motives. Marcus watched this process with interest, noting how Kyle handled both acceptance and rejection with equal grace. The former bully was clearly struggling with the weight of his past actions, but he persevered in his efforts to make amends. "I talked to Amy Chen today," Kyle reported during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. "She told me that after she stood up for you in the cafeteria, I made her so uncomfortable that she had to change her entire class schedule. How did she respond to your apology?" "She said she appreciated it, but that she's still not ready to forgive me, and that's okay. I don't have a right to forgiveness just because I feel bad about what I did." Marcus nodded approvingly. Kyle's understanding of accountability and consequence had grown considerably since their confrontation. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself navigating his own transformation within the school's social hierarchy. Students who had previously ignored him now sought him out for conversation, advice, and in some cases, protection. The revelation of his martial arts background and his father's professional fighting career had elevated him to a kind of legendary status that he found both uncomfortable and burdensome. Marcus, a nervous freshman named Peter, approached him during lunch. "Some seniors have been bothering me in the bathroom, taking my money and threatening to flush my head in the toilet. Could you maybe talk to them?" Marcus set down his sandwich and studied the younger boy's face. Peter was small for his age, with thick glasses and the kind of nervous demeanor that seemed to attract predators. "Have you reported this to the administration?" Peter shook his head. "They'll just make it worse. You know how it is." Marcus did know how it was. His own experience with Kyle's systematic harassment had demonstrated the limitations of official channels when dealing with social aggression that was carefully designed to fly under the radar of adult oversight. "What are their names?" Marcus asked. Peter provided the information reluctantly, clearly afraid of potential retaliation. Marcus made mental notes about the students involved, recognizing two of them as friends of Tommy Chen, who had apparently decided to continue Kyle's legacy of predatory behavior. "I'll handle it," Marcus said simply. The confrontation with Peter's tormentors occurred the next day in the hallway between third and fourth periods. Marcus approached the group of seniors with the same calm confidence he had displayed before his fight with Kyle, his reputation preceding him like an invisible shield. "Gentlemen," Marcus said politely, interrupting their conversation, "I believe you've been bothering Peter Hartley." The seniors turned to face him, their expressions shifting from casual confidence to nervous uncertainty as they recognized who was addressing them. The tallest of the group, a linebacker named Brett Patterson, who had previously demonstrated his aggressive tendencies during wrestling practice, attempted to maintain an air of defiance. "What's it to you, Rivera? The little twerp's not your problem." "Actually," Marcus replied calmly, "anyone being bullied in this school is my problem now, just like Kyle Brennan was my problem." The reference to Kyle's very public defeat sent a visible chill through the group. They had all seen the videos, all heard the stories about Marcus's technical dismantling of Westfield's former alpha predator. "We weren't bullying anyone," another senior protested weakly. "Just having some fun." "Taking someone's lunch money and threatening to assault them isn't fun," Marcus observed. "It's extortion and intimidation, criminal behavior." Brett's face flushed with anger at being lectured by someone younger and smaller. "You think you're hot shit because you got lucky against Kyle? Maybe you need to learn that not everyone is impressed by your daddy's fighting career?" Marcus took a step closer, and Brett instinctively stepped back, his body recognizing a threat that his ego was trying to deny. "I hope I don't need to demonstrate how unimpressed I am by your posturing," Marcus said quietly. "But if you continue to bother Peter or anyone else, we'll have a conversation similar to the one Kyle and I had. And I think you've seen how those conversations tend to end. The group exchanged uncertain glances, clearly weighing their options. Brett made one last attempt to save face. Fine, but this doesn't make you the king of the school or anything. You can't protect everyone. You're right, Marcus agreed. I can't protect everyone, but I can protect the people who ask for my help. And I can make sure that anyone who chooses to be a predator understands the potential consequences of that choice. The seniors dispersed without further protest, and Marcus never heard another complaint about Peter being harassed. Word spread quickly through the school's informal communication networks that Marcus Rivera was willing to intervene on behalf of bullying victims, and the mere possibility of his involvement became a deterrent to aggressive behavior. But Marcus was careful not to let his reputation become a tool for vigilante justice. When students approached him with complaints about unfair treatment or social conflicts, he encouraged them first to seek resolution through appropriate channels. He intervened directly only when those channels had failed and when clear patterns of predatory behavior were evident. "You're walking a fine line," Roberto observed during one of their evening training sessions. "Using your reputation to protect others is admirable, but you need to be careful not to become what Kyle was, a person who solves problems through intimidation." "I understand the distinction," Marcus replied, working through a series of guard passes with methodical precision. "Kyle used intimidation to create problems and maintain dominance. I'm using the threat of consequences to prevent problems and protect victims." "The difference is in your motivation and your methods," Roberto agreed. "But others may not see that distinction as clearly as you do. You need to be prepared for the possibility that your role as protector could be misinterpreted or corrupted." The wisdom of Roberto's warning became apparent during Marcus's encounter with a group of students who had clearly misunderstood his position within the school's social hierarchy. 3 juniors approached him in the hallway with what they apparently thought was a business proposition. "Rivera," one of them said with a conspiratorial grin, "we heard you're the new enforcer around here. We've got a problem with some kids in our chemistry class who keep showing us up on tests. Think you could have a word with them? Convince them to dial back their academic performance?" Marcus stared at them in disbelief. "You want me to intimidate other students into getting worse grades?" "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds bad," the student backpedaled. "But they're making the rest of us look stupid. It's not fair." "You're making yourselves look stupid," Marcus replied coldly. "And if you think I'm going to help you do it, you've completely misunderstood who I am and what I represent." The students left, looking confused and embarrassed. But the incident served as a reminder that his reputation was a double-edged sword. Some people would always seek to exploit or corrupt power, regardless of how it was intended to be used. Kyle's transformation, meanwhile, continued to evolve in ways that surprised both Marcus and the broader school community. The former bully had joined the peer mediation program and started volunteering at a local youth center, working with elementary school children who were experiencing their own social difficulties. "I figured if I could learn to recognize the signs of bullying behavior, maybe I could help other kids avoid becoming what I was," Kyle explained during one of their conversations. "It's weird, actually talking to the little kids about treating each other with respect when I spent years doing the exact opposite. How do they respond to you? They don't know who I used to be, so they just see me as this older kid who's trying to help them solve their problems. It's refreshing, being judged by who I am now instead of who I was." Jake Morrison and Tommy Chen, meanwhile, had struggled with the new social order in different ways. Jake had initially attempted to maintain Kyle's legacy of aggressive dominance, but without Kyle's charisma and social connections, his efforts had been clumsy and ineffective. After a few failed attempts to establish himself as the new alpha predator, he had grudgingly retreated into relative anonymity. Tommy had taken a different approach, apparently deciding that if he couldn't dominate others through intimidation, he would seek acceptance through humor and self-deprecation. His transformation was less profound than Kyle's, but seemed genuine in its own way. "I've been thinking about what you said to Kyle," Tommy told Marcus one afternoon, "about choosing to be something else. I don't think I want to be the kind of person who needs to make others feel small to feel good about myself." "What kind of person do you want to be?" Tommy considered the question seriously. "Someone who makes people laugh with me instead of at other people. Someone who builds people up instead of tearing them down." The most significant test of the new order came on a crisp Friday afternoon in late November. Marcus was walking to his car after school when he noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A cluster of students had gathered in the kind of circle that usually indicated either a fight or systematic harassment, their excited voices carrying across the courtyard. Marcus approached the crowd with the deliberate calm that had become his trademark, his presence immediately noticed by the students on the periphery. As he moved closer, he could see the situation unfolding in the center of the circle. A thin freshman with dark hair and nervous eyes was surrounded by 3 sophomore football players who were taking turns shoving him back and forth while laughing at his attempts to retrieve his scattered homework. The scene was depressingly familiar, a replay of the systematic harassment that Marcus himself had endured for months. "Come on, David," one of the sophomores was saying in a mocking tone. "Fight back. Show us how tough you are." The freshman David was obviously terrified, but trying to maintain some dignity, reaching for his papers while avoiding the eyes of the students who were recording his humiliation for social media posterity. "Please," David said quietly, "I just want to get my homework and go home." "Homework is for nerds," another sophomore replied, deliberately stepping on one of David's worksheets. "Maybe you need to learn some social skills instead." Marcus felt a familiar cold anger settling in his chest, the same controlled fury that had eventually driven him to confront Kyle Brennan. But this time, he wasn't the victim. This time, he was in a position to intervene before the harassment escalated into something more serious. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked calmly, his voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. The crowd immediately shifted, students turning to watch the new arrival with anticipation and excitement. The 3 sophomores looked up from their harassment to see Marcus Rivera standing at the edge of the circle. His hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes carrying the kind of focused intensity that had become legendary among Westfield's student body. "No problem," the apparent leader of the group said quickly, recognizing the potential threat that Marcus represented. "Just messing around with the freshman." "It doesn't look like he's having fun," Marcus observed, nodding toward David, who was still trying to gather his scattered papers. "He's fine," another sophomore insisted. "Aren't you fine, David?" David looked between his tormentors and Marcus, clearly understanding that his answer could determine how the situation developed. "I just want to collect my homework and leave," he said quietly. Marcus nodded and walked into the circle, his movement causing the sophomores to step back involuntarily. He knelt down and began helping David gather the scattered papers, his actions sending a clear message about where his sympathies lay. "You know," Marcus said conversationally while collecting worksheets, "I used to be in David's position, surrounded by people who thought my suffering was entertainment." The sophomores exchanged nervous glances, clearly uncertain about how to respond to Marcus's intervention. "That was different," one of them protested weakly. "Kyle was being a real asshole. We're just having some fun." Marcus straightened up, holding the collected papers, and looked directly at the student who had spoken. "Kyle thought he was just having fun too, right up until he learned otherwise." The reference to Kyle's very public defeat sent a visible chill through the group and the surrounding crowd. Everyone present understood exactly what Marcus was implying about the potential consequences of continuing their harassment. "Look," the leader of the sophomores said, apparently deciding that retreat was the better part of valor. "We didn't mean anything by it. We were just bored." "Then find something else to do," Marcus suggested calmly. "Something that doesn't involve making other people miserable." The sophomores dispersed quickly, followed by most of the crowd who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Marcus handed David his papers and offered him a slight smile. "You okay?" Marcus asked. David nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I didn't know what to do. They've been bothering me for weeks, and every time I try to avoid them, they just find me somewhere else." Marcus felt a pang of recognition at David's description. "What's your name?" "David Martinez. I'm a freshman. I'm Marcus Rivera. And David, if they bother you again, come find me. Nobody should have to deal with that alone." David's eyes widened slightly. "Really? You do that? Really? But I want you to remember something important." Marcus placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Standing up for yourself doesn't mean you have to become someone who hurts others. The goal isn't to become the predator. The goal is to make sure predators understand that their behavior has consequences." David nodded seriously, clearly processing the distinction Marcus was drawing. "And David, report this to the administration too. Even if they don't act immediately, having an official record creates accountability. Sometimes adults need multiple reports before they recognize patterns." As David walked away with his rescued homework, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since his own confrontation with Kyle's group on the stairwell. He had gone from being the victim of systematic harassment to being someone other victims could turn to for protection and support. But more importantly, his intervention had been successful without requiring any violence. The mere possibility of consequences had been sufficient to end the harassment, demonstrating that his reputation could be used as a tool for peace rather than intimidation. "That was well handled," a familiar voice said behind him. Marcus turned to see Kyle approaching, his expression showing genuine approval and perhaps a hint of pride. "How long were you watching?" Marcus asked. "Long enough to see you do what I should have been doing for years," Kyle replied, "protecting people instead of preying on them." They walked together toward the parking lot, two young men who had found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that had fundamentally changed both of their lives. "I've been thinking about what you said about choosing to be something else," Kyle continued. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant." "What do you understand?" Kyle was quiet for a moment, apparently organizing his thoughts. "That real strength isn't about dominating other people. It's about having the power to hurt them and choosing not to. It's about using whatever advantages you have to protect rather than exploit." Marcus nodded approvingly. "My father always taught me that a true warrior doesn't fight to prove himself. He fights only when fighting is the only option left. And today, fighting wasn't necessary because your reputation did the work for you," Kyle observed. "Those sophomores backed down because they knew what you were capable of, not because you threatened them." "Exactly. The goal isn't to be feared. The goal is to be respected enough that people think twice before acting badly." As they reached their cars, Kyle turned to face Marcus directly. "I want you to know that watching you handle that situation, it made me proud to call you a friend, not because of your fighting skills, but because of your character." Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the day. For months, he had seen Kyle only as an antagonist, a source of constant harassment and humiliation. The idea that they could develop a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. "Thank you, Kyle. That means a lot." As Marcus drove home through the comfortable suburban streets of his neighborhood, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had come to Westfield High School hoping for anonymity and peaceful education. Instead, he had been forced to confront systematic harassment, defend himself through violence, and ultimately accept a role as protector and mentor for other students facing similar challenges. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had revealed strengths in himself that went beyond martial arts techniques. He had learned to use his reputation responsibly, to distinguish between justice and revenge, and to help others find their own strength rather than simply solving their problems for them. Most importantly, he had learned that true strength meant more than the ability to defeat opponents in physical confrontation. It meant having the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show restraint, the courage to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and the character to help former enemies become better people. As he pulled into his driveway and saw his father waiting in the doorway with an approving smile, Marcus understood that his journey from victim to protector was really a journey toward becoming the kind of man his parents had always hoped he would be. The techniques Roberto had taught him were just tools. The real lessons had been about character, responsibility, and the proper use of strength in service of justice. Tonight, he would train with his father and discuss the day's events, analyzing not just the tactical aspects of his intervention, but the moral and ethical dimensions of his growing role within the school community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that strength and compassion were not contradictory qualities, but complementary aspects of true leadership. The quiet transfer student who had once absorbed abuse in silence had become something more, a guardian, a mentor, and ultimately a young man worthy of the respect he had earned through his choices rather than his capabilities. In protecting others, he had found his own strength. In helping former enemies become better people, he had discovered the true meaning of victory. The mouse had not only become a lion, he had learned to use his roar in service of those who had no voice of their own.